This is The Cowboy's Second Chance, a Sweetwater Ranch Western cowboy romance. Written by Jessie Gussman. Performed by Jay Dyess. Chapter 1. Mrs. Bonnie Stryker clicked send, then closed her laptop with a small cramp in her stomach. What had started out years ago as an acquaintance of a friend helping her fix her laptop had turned into an odd friendship of its own. She pushed back away from her desk. Oil man. That's all she knew him as. Of course, he only knew her as Stryker Mom. She deliberately misspelled her last name to keep anyone from tracing her. She supposed he was some kind of tech dude from somewhere out east. A city guy for sure. A nice man. He knew she lived in North Dakota, but it was a big state, and she'd never told him where. Plus, she was almost 50 and had 8 kids. She felt pretty safe from any kind of romantic interest since he knew about her kids from the beginning. 8 kids would almost certainly scare most men completely off. Oil Man had not gotten romantic at all, but he'd still offered her friendship. A slow, years-long building that hadn't scared her away, like it might have if he'd been too pushy. Not that she worried. There weren't too many men who would look at her, a matronly-figured grandmother, and think romance. "Hey, Mom, I'm off to orchestra practice." Charlie, her youngest child, the one she'd been pregnant with when her husband died, called from the back door. "Okay, sweetie, be careful," she said, getting up from her chair and grabbing her phone. "If you wait to feed until I get back, I'll help you," Charlie said from the doorway. "I'll have the feeding done and supper on the table." She walked from the living room to the kitchen doorway where she could see her daughter, all grown up, a senior this year, wearing jeans and a sweatshirt, boots and a beanie cap. North Dakota in April was dependable. It would be unpredictable. You could bank on it. Bonnie's phone buzzed in her hand, but she didn't look at it. Rather, she shoved down the burst of nerves that tried to set fire to her stomach. "Mom, I'll help. You just have to wait." "We'll see." She didn't want to argue about it. Also, her phone was almost burning a hole in her hand. Would he have answered her that fast? Charlie lifted her brows, knowing that "we'll see" was her mother's way of ending the argument and intending to do her own thing. Sometimes parents just had to do things for survival, particularly single moms. The door clicked closed as Charlie left. Bonnie allowed the silence of the kitchen to soak into her, closing her eyes and breathing deeply of the familiar scent of her home. Coffee mixed with vanilla and cinnamon, and the fresh air farm smell that all her children had been raised on. It hadn't been easy, but Charlie was just a few days away from graduating from high school. Bonnie wasn't under the delusion that her work would be done when Charlie graduated. She was simply entering another chapter of her life. It was tempting to think about how different things would be if her husband were still alive. But looking back never fixed anything, and it just depressed her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, reminding her of why her stomach cramped and her heart thundered. Faintly, the sound of gravel crunching and a motor fading told her that Charlie had pulled out of the drive and was gone. She was alone. Her fingers trembled as she pulled the phone out of her pocket. She didn't look at it. Not yet. Did she really want to know what it said? What he said? Oil man. He'd asked to meet her. She told him she wanted to know his name first. How could she contemplate meeting someone when she didn't even know their name? She suspected the buzzing of her phone was his answer. It stood to reason if he wanted to meet her, he'd be willing to tell her his name. But of course, if he told her his name, she'd have to cough up hers. Throughout all the years of raising children, the craziness of ranching, the hardscrabble life, the uncertainty of beef prices and corn prices and emergency room visits, middle-of-the-night doctor visits, children that fought, and one child that left and she didn't even know where he was. All of that. Throughout it all, he'd been the constant in her life. Not as a person. She'd never met him. But his emails were consistent, his support unwavering. Not romantic. She'd talked about her day or week, her life, and he answered, talking about his own life as well. He'd been someone she'd been able to unburden on. He'd given her good advice, and then he talked and listened and she gave her own advice right back to him. Did she want that relationship to change? She'd been happy with the way it was. Their current one offered no stress, an online friendship with someone she couldn't see but was comfortable with. Did she want to know him as a real, live person? Part of her did. Part of her had always wanted more. But it had been decades. Why would he want to meet now? She supposed it was possible he wanted to meet his friends, but it was also possible, probable maybe, that he wanted more. She wasn't sure about what she wanted. All kinds of possibilities raced through her mind. He could be 30 years older than her and in a nursing home. She didn't know. Or he could be younger. Did she want to take a chance on someone younger? Maybe she should find these things out before they agreed to meet. She'd never asked his age or for a picture. He certainly hadn't mentioned it either. But it seemed shallow to want to know what he looked like, or how old he was, or even how much money he had. Those things shouldn't matter. But she'd been an adult long enough to know that one couldn't live on love, and that some things really did matter. But how did one ask a person whether they were a registered sex offender? She wasn't sure she wanted to go through all the stress and strain of thinking about it. She was happy the way she was. She didn't need a man in her life, especially now that her children were grown and raised. Being single definitely had its perks. Her fingers tightened around her phone. When he'd suggested they meet, everything changed, whether she wanted it to or not. To think anything different was to be in denial. She raised her phone, turning it so the screen faced her. It blinked on. 2 email notifications. One from her sister in Nevada, and one from Oil Man. She swiped and clicked, taking a breath and sinking into a kitchen chair. There was no salutation.
My name is Howard Edwards. I own several businesses here on the East Coast. You can Google me, but there shouldn't be much that comes up, as I have specifically requested to be a silent partner in all my endeavors. I could give you a lot more personal information about myself, information that we haven't shared throughout the years. Some of it I know will not matter, and some of it I believe you will recognize. It's because of this latter information that I would like to meet you face to face as we talk about it. If 20 years of correspondence aren't enough to convince you that I'm not a serial killer or something of that nature, I certainly understand if you'd like to bring a companion with you. Again, because of that information, I hope we can meet somewhere other than Sweetwater. I promise you will understand after our meeting. Nothing bad, just personal. I thought long and hard before asking to meet you, because I've enjoyed our correspondence over the years and didn't want to destroy what I felt was a strong bond of friendship. But my desire to see you, and to possibly have something more with you, overcame my fear of losing you completely. I've also had some recent events in my life that have made it possible for me to be free to make this request of you. If you decide that you'd rather keep our relationship where it's been for the last 20 years, I completely understand. and I'm willing to respect that. Maybe meeting won't change anything. Maybe you'll decide we'd be happier continuing our correspondence. But I'm not going to pretend that I'm not hoping for something more. With admiration, Mr. Edwards.
Chapter 2. Howard Edwards sat at his desk in Elizabethtown, New Jersey, tapping his pen on the desk calendar and looking out the 7th-story window over the industrial park that his company owned. It was time. It had been 20 years, and it was past time for him to go back to the land of his childhood, and go back to the woman that he never stopped loving, not through anything. If she'd have him. She might be happy with her life the way it was, and not want any ripples to disturb her at this point in time. But he couldn't live the rest of his life without at least trying, now that he was free to do so. The pen slipped out of his hand and bounced onto the floor. With shaking fingers, he picked it up. His knees knocked together, and he didn't try to keep them still. He hadn't felt this nervous anticipation for a long time, and she was keeping him waiting. It had been 15 minutes since he'd sent his email, and she hadn't replied. Maybe she wouldn't. Maybe she'd think about it and write something next week. He almost groaned at the thought. A smart woman wouldn't meet a man by herself. It didn't matter if they'd been corresponding for 2 decades or not. He could have been in prison all that time. Prisoners were allowed to send emails, correct? He wasn't really sure. In his line of work, that wasn't information that he needed to know, and therefore he didn't know it. But he thought his Bonnie was the kind of woman that would take a chance. He also thought that what they'd built over the years online would mean enough to her that she'd want to at least meet him. He wasn't wrong very often. But another 5 minutes ticked by, and she still hadn't answered. Funny, because they seldom sent more than 2 emails a week anyway. He didn't have any right to actually expect her to answer immediately, other than he wanted to know, right now. He had work he could do, data that needed his experienced eye, inspections that needed to be done, department heads he needed to set up meetings with. But he wouldn't be paying attention. His mind would be on Bonnie, so it was kind of silly to do anything but sit and wait. He pushed back away from the desk, ready to pace, but his phone buzzed. He grabbed it right away from where it was sitting face down on his desk. But he didn't turn it over. What if she told him no? He'd want to go to North Dakota anyway, to Sweetwater, to see Bonnie Stryker and look at how the years had changed her and shaped her, to see the woman that she had become. But he needed to respect her answer, and if she said no, that she still wanted to email, or maybe that she didn't even want to email anymore at all, and at that point, his heart bucked and kicked in protest. He had to accept it. It would certainly make his life easier if she said no, because there were a lot of things he would have to arrange, and a lot of people who would not be happy with him if she said yes. His heart wanted her to say yes. With the resoluteness that had served him well in business, he picked his phone up and turned it to face him, then read her email. Howard Edwards. I suppose there were a lot of times over the years when I wondered what your name really was. I wouldn't have guessed Howard. It's a good, strong name. I like it. Edwards is the last name of a family that started my town, here in North Dakota. In fact, the town is named for their ranch, Sweetwater. I understand that you want to meet, and I can see your point. Some things are better talked about face to face. Let's meet in Rockerton next Tuesday. I'm on the city council, and my daughter has graduation ceremonies that I need to attend. But after that, my boys can take care of the feeding, and the ranch can live without me for a day. I'll be there, alone. Bonnie. Chapter 3. Bonnie Stryker clutched her purse and walked up the cracked sidewalk of downtown Rockerton, North Dakota. The sky was a deep blue, the kind she could look up at and almost feel like it was real enough to touch. No clouds broke the vast blueness, and the temperatures were warm enough to go without a coat. Maybe she could even lose her sweater. But she wanted to keep it on. It felt like armor. That and her purse. Things to do with her hands. Something to focus her attention on. Something to try to hide her nervousness with. She'd agreed to meet. She really didn't think he was some kind of serial killer or a rapist or out to harm her in any way. Her fears were much more about what he would think of her. Maybe he had some ideal in his mind about what she was, and she would never live up to it. It was so much easier to put her best foot forward in an email and hide the bad things. The fights between her kids, the child that left home and never returned, with the last words he said being, "I hate you, Mom." The money issues that never went away, the wrinkles that got deeper every year, and the hair that was almost all gray. She probably never mentioned any of that stuff to Oil Man. Howard. Nor the extra weight she carried around her middle. Her graying hair was thinner, too. She looked like a grandma. Her good works weren't getting her into heaven. Her good looks weren't going to either. She hoped Mr. Edwards wasn't disappointed. Surely, he expected her to look like she had carried and raised 8 kids and was now a grandmother. Surely, there were things he didn't tell her. And that was a whole other set of fears for her. What if he wasn't what she had built him up to be over the years? She shoved the thought away. They were just going to meet. Good friends. Out for a cup of coffee. Just because they'd never met before and had been talking for 20 years didn't change the fact that they were friends. Just friends. She opened the coffee shop door where he'd suggested they meet. He seemed familiar with Rockerton, and that had made her smile, because it meant that he'd researched the area. He even knew the seating arrangements, and he'd suggested they try to get the booth by the corner window. There was a man sitting there now, alone, watching the door. His eyes were on hers when she walked in. Her breath caught. And she knew it was him. Not because he looked the way she pictured him. He didn't. But he seemed to recognize her. Or maybe because he was obviously looking for someone. She told him she'd be wearing a green sweater, and his eyes slipped down, maybe to confirm her outfit, because he didn't seem confused about whether or not she was the right person. They tracked back up to her face, and he stood. She walked over, trying to make her steps casual and not seem like she was rushing, which she wanted to do. His hair was salt and pepper gray, and there was a lot of it. His eyes were dark, maybe black. His nose was bold, and he had the jaw of a superhero. His smile showed perfect teeth, and she didn't have to worry about whether or not he was taller than she was. He might have had a little bit of a middle-age spread that had stayed into older age, but not as much as she did. Of course, he hadn't borne 8 children either. But they weren't his kids, and she didn't suppose she got credit for them.
"Bonnie?"
he said, and his voice was deep and rough, definitely a voice she could get used to listening to. She wouldn't mind talking to him on the phone and hearing it at night before she went to bed. It hadn't really been a question, but she nodded and said yes anyway. Maybe she thought he was going to hold his hand out and shake, but by the time they got within 3 feet of each other, he had both of his arms open wide, and before she knew it, those arms, stronger than they looked, had gone around her and pulled her into a chest that smelled like open air and spice, with a masculine maturity that she hadn't smelled for a long time. It made her want to move closer. But she patted him carefully on the back and stepped away, feeling somehow reluctant but knowing it was what she needed to do. "It's nice to finally meet you, Mr. Edwards," she said, feeling somehow too formal for the situation but not feeling like it was a good idea to get too close too soon.
"Call me Howard,"
he said. Obviously, he was willing to move a lot faster than she was. She gave a little smile but didn't answer. It wasn't that she felt uncomfortable or even that she thought there was any need to keep a distance between them. It simply felt safer. And after raising 8 kids alone, maybe she was accustomed to choosing the safer option.
"I just got here 5 minutes ago, and the waitress brought 2 waters. I told her I would wait to order anything else until you arrived."
He swept a hand toward the table he'd vacated.
"Let's sit down."
He put a hand on her shoulder. She wasn't used to people touching her. Her own children? Yes. Men? No way. She might have hugged her pastor a time or two in the last 2 decades, but she couldn't think of another man that she'd allowed into her personal space in that time. It seemed like too much of a risk with all of her children depending on her. Not like there had been men beating down her doors to try to get to her. Her ranch wasn't worth that much. It wasn't big. It would never make anyone rich. But she'd been able to scratch a living out of it, with the money from the ranch and the $1,000 a week that someone had sent her consistently since the week her husband died. She hadn't really met Mr. Edwards until a year or so after her husband had passed, so she didn't think the money was from him, although the thought had crossed her mind that it could be him more than once. The check was in the mail every Friday. Still, she didn't try to shrug his hand off or move away, like she might have if it had been someone else. The hand felt right somehow, sitting there on her shoulder. Warm. Comforting, even. She would have said she was too old, but she felt a little spark in her belly, and her heart did a quick twirl. Odd. He stood while she slid into her side of the booth, and then he walked around and sat opposite her.
"After all those years of emailing back and forth, I can hardly believe you're sitting across the table from me."
He put his hands on the table in front of him. Her eyes were drawn to them. Long fingers, brown. Not a farmer's hands. No scars, for one. And the fingers were slim. Still, a man's hands, and she admired them. "I feel the same," she said. "I'm nervous, though, too. And I'm not sure why. I mean, we've talked about almost everything over the years. You probably know more about me than my children do." They exchanged smiles, and some of her nervousness faded away.
"I feel like I know your children. I can give you all their names and birth dates. I haven't been there for their birthday parties over the years, but you've told me all about them. I kind of feel like if I saw them, I would recognize them. You've sent pictures."
She smiled and nodded, her nervousness disappearing. "And you never had children. Sometimes I thought you enjoyed my family because of that." He nodded and smiled a little.
"That's true, I did."
His hands steepled together, and he took a deep breath.
"But that's one of the things maybe I need to talk to you about. One of the things I didn't need to tell you while we were emailing, but I need to tell you now."
Her mouth was suddenly dry, and she took a drink of the water that sat in front of her. This was what she was afraid of. What things didn't she know? The waitress bustled over and asked about drinks. Bonnie hadn't even opened the menu in front of her, and after the waitress left, she did so, skimming over it and finding something that would suffice to eat. She wasn't really here to enjoy food, so she didn't worry too much about what she was ordering. Something simple. She made a comment about the weather and asked about his trip while they were waiting for the waitress to come back. When she took their order and left, Bonnie prompted Howard, since he had seemed to forget he was on the brink of telling her something major. Or maybe he was just as nervous as she. "So, what's the thing that you need to tell me?" she asked, clasping her hands together so he couldn't see they were shaking. One side of his mouth tilted up, and she noticed the smile lines in his cheeks. She liked them. Hopefully, they said he was generally happy and smiled a good bit.
"There are probably a lot of things that I need to tell you, things that maybe didn't come up over the years. But the one that we were talking about, our family."
He paused.
"I never mentioned my wife."
She didn't know whether his pause was deliberate or not. Deliberate so she could digest that information. She was absolutely certain he had never mentioned his wife. She had no idea he had a wife. Would she have been emailing him if she had known? It wasn't like they were lovers online or anything. They had never flirted. They had never talked suggestively to each other. It was definitely a friendship, nothing more. Trying to think back over the years, would she have been okay with everything that she had ever said to him if her husband had been alive? He was a friend that had started out as a work acquaintance, someone who would fix her computer for her online. She didn't even remember what the problem was, but he had taken over her screen and gone in and fixed it. Yes, she finally decided. She probably wouldn't have had as much time or desire to email if she had been married and her husband had been alive. She had never said anything inappropriate to him, nor he to her. So she didn't feel like he had cheated on his wife, nor that she had been carrying on with a married man. "You have to know that's a shock to me." She looked up into his eyes as she said it, trying to judge whether he looked guilty or not. Either he was really good at hiding his facial expressions, or he didn't feel the slightest bit of guilt.
"I know. When we first started emailing each other, it didn't seem like something I needed to say. I helped you fix your computer, if I remember correctly."
His voice had gone up a little, like that was a question, and she answered him by nodding. "That's right."
"It didn't seem like it was appropriate for me to be like, 'I'll help you fix your computer. I'm married, no charge.'"
He gave a little smile and held his hands palm up, like he was showing he was innocent. She had to snort a bit, because the way he said it was funny. "Okay, I'll give you that. That would have been a little weird."
"Yeah, that's what I thought too. But then we kept emailing. Probably I asked you how it was going, if your computer was working okay. Then you probably answered that it was fine, and that if your kids didn't break it, it would work for a long time. And I probably said something along the lines of, 'How old are your children?' or something like that. And that's how it started."
"Yes," she agreed. "That's exactly how it started. I never thought for one second that we would be emailing each other for all these years." He used one finger to move his napkin around, then straightened it so that it was square with the end of the table.
"At some point, after we'd been emailing for a little bit, and it was obviously no longer about fixing computers, I knew I should say something about my wife. But your emails were friendly, nothing more. And if I started talking about my wife, explaining about her, I was afraid you would think that it was more. There was another reason that it couldn't be more, other than my wife, of course."
Seemed like her alarm bells were working overtime today, because that comment set them off too. "More stuff you didn't tell me?" His lip pulled back, and he nodded. "So..." She drew the word out and then paused, wanting to fidget in her seat. "Are you still married?" Her back straightened, solid as a telephone pole. She was going to get up and walk out if he was still married. She wasn't having lunch with a married man, she liked him. Maybe his jovial nature, the laugh lines that said so much to her, his consideration in letting her sit down first. Or maybe it was the familiarity of talking with someone who knew her so well. Birthdays, her kids, and all the other things they'd shared over the years. It made her heart feel hollow somehow to know that he'd been married all the time. Or maybe the problem was that she hadn't known.
"We got married when we were young,"
he began, like she'd asked him to speak, like he was answering a question. But he wasn't. Not the one she'd asked.
"Maybe we were too young. That's what everyone said. We weren't even married 6 months when she left."
She bit back a gasp and a sigh.
"She never filed for divorce, and I didn't either."
He took a hand and ran it through his hair like he was agitated.
"I guess I should have. In hindsight, that might have been best, since she was the one who left. But I guess there was a part of me that didn't want to do the D word."
Bonnie nodded slowly. She could understand, and that made sense to her. He couldn't really make his partner stay if she wanted to leave. She didn't have any experience in that, but being a widow was one thing. Being a divorcee was something different. Maybe a person couldn't help either one, but neither was something that she would want to be if she had a choice. She tilted her head and balled up her straw paper. "So you've been married this whole time, but your wife hasn't been living with you? Are you still married?" Maybe that was a probing personal question, but again, she didn't necessarily want to eat with someone else's husband, and he hadn't answered her the first time. She wasn't looking for a man to share. She wasn't really looking for a man at all. But if she were going to get one, he was going to belong to only her. The waitress came with their food, setting it down in front of them. Howard thanked her, giving her a smile that was friendly but held no flirt, and that impressed Bonnie. She wasn't interested in a flirt either. What was she thinking? She hadn't really come into this thinking that anything was going to happen. Had she? Howard didn't pick up his silverware, though, just fiddled with the end of his fork.
"I guess I should tell you the whole story of my wife, and then you'll know."
Bonnie paused, staring at her chicken salad. There was a story? More? She only wanted to know if there was still a wife. "Okay, yes. I'd really like to know the story of your wife." She hoped that was the truth. Maybe she didn't want to know. But she couldn't close her ears off because she was afraid. Being a single mom had certainly taught her that. She needed to face problems head on, because they always got bigger as she ignored them. Howard chuckled lightly.
"I don't know where I got the idea that you and I would meet, and we'd laugh together and enjoy ourselves and stroll along talking about simple things, like our hopes and dreams, maybe even the weather."
He laughed again. This time, he met her eyes. His laugh lines stretched out from either side of his dark eyes, and the grooves in his face deepened from what she'd seen earlier. Yeah, he was a laugher. From emailing him, she figured he would be. It was satisfying to know that she was right. "Maybe we can do that after we eat. Rockerton has a beautiful park and a pretty pond." She dug into her chicken salad. She knew some people, women mostly, who couldn't eat when they were upset. She'd never had that problem. It was a good thing, too, since she'd be as skinny as a fence post if she did. Life was full of problems.
"I told you my wife left me, but we didn't get divorced, and I don't want you to get the idea that there was something wrong with her. I was young, too."
His voice held regret.
"I was probably really hard to get along with. Young and dumb, arrogant, knew it all. I had a ranch up in the northwestern part of the state."
"You lived in North Dakota?" Bonnie knew she was interrupting him, but this was news to her. She thought of him as an Easterner. She supposed she had assumed that was where he was from, since he told her that was where he currently lived. She had never pictured him as originally being from the West, from North Dakota. He nodded.
But I had to sell it. I couldn't make ends meet. Hot and dry, cold and miserable, and really tough to make a living up there. But then the natural gas craze hit, and I got a really good price for my ranch.
Bonnie nodded, sure she understood now. So you sold out, moved east, and bought a business or something? Howard shook his head.
Not exactly. I did get a great price for my ranch, but I invested most of the money. I was able, however, to buy a second ranch. I didn't pay full price for that one, since it was in my family. I bought out my grandparents.
Oh, Bonnie said after she swallowed a bite of lettuce. Where was that ranch at?
Sweetwater.
She froze, her fork full of chicken halfway to her mouth. Her entire body felt almost as if she'd stuck her finger in an electrical socket. Shockwaves rolled up and down her legs. Her brain didn't seem to be working, and she knew her mouth was hanging open. He had a ranch in Sweetwater? 35 years ago, she had married her husband and moved to Sweetwater from down around Fargo. Her husband had grown up in Sweetwater, on the ranch that she now lived on. Howard would have known her husband. It wasn't inconceivable that he might have known her, too. Her words came to her slowly. So you lived in Sweetwater? On the Sweetwater Ranch? You probably knew my husband then, Joel Stryker? Howard put his fork on the table. He leaned closer, his eyes dead serious.
I knew your husband.
There was a brief pause.
And I knew you.
Chapter 4. Howard hadn't meant to break things to her quite like that. Honestly, he'd wanted to go a lot slower. A walk by the pond talking about their lives. Maybe discussing Charlie's graduation. Maybe he would have talked to her about some of his businesses and how he wasn't in IT, just fiddled with computers on the side. How he imported and exported oil. All of that would have been preferable to what he actually started off with, which was everything that he hadn't wanted to tell her right away. And now he had shocked her. But he hadn't told her anything that wasn't true. And he hadn't told her anything that she hadn't needed to know. If he wanted to move on with her, he had, and now, after meeting her, he really did. She needed to know everything that he'd said. And more. He could see where she began to put things together in her mind. He could see the light dawning. Her eyes narrowed, and she almost squinted at him, with her head tilted. That was something he'd never seen from the email. Her facial expressions, how open they were. Everything she thought was on her face. She didn't try to hide things. He liked that. Of course, he liked her before, too. Back when he was best friends with her husband. Before they got married. He could see the wheels in her head turning. And yeah, she had almost figured it out. You're Ward. Her eyes, a light blue color, were sharp and seemed to pierce into him.
That's correct. When I was younger, I went by Ward.
But your last name was different. Her forehead scrunched up like she was trying to remember, and it hurt his heart a little to think that she didn't remember him like he remembered her. Of course, she had been in love with Joel.
It was. It used to be Richardson. But when my dad left my mom, she went back to her maiden name, And that was about the time that I wanted to make a new beginning for myself, too. So I took her maiden name as well, Edwards. The Sweetwater Ranch went down through the Edwards side of my family anyway. But that's why you didn't recognize my name. Because, yeah, you would have known me as Ward Richardson.
She had quit trying to eat, and he felt bad that he'd obviously ruined her appetite. Leaning back in her chair, she had one arm crossed over her stomach, and she tapped her chin with a finger from the other hand. You and my husband had a falling out, but my husband would never say what it was over.
You.
That was easy. There was nothing else that would separate him from his best friend except the girl he loved, who loved his best friend. Me? She asked incredulously. Silently, he thanked Joel for never mentioning their fight to Bonnie. Obviously, she had no idea what he was talking about. It was too late to pay Joel back, although maybe he already had. After all, he'd helped to raise Joel's children. Not physical work, but he'd made sure there was money every week. He nodded.
I suppose you've lived long enough to know how these things go. Stupid things people fight about, quit talking over, and then can never remember why they were fighting in the first place. I never forgot about why we fought, but I do regret the fighting.
She understood because she was nodding. But he supposed he hadn't told her everything.
You came up to teach in the school, and I was the one that told Joel about you. Otherwise, he would never have met you, at least not until after I'd had a chance. But he and I were best friends. I told him of everything, including, and maybe especially, the girl with the laughing blue eyes who I met when I was at the school to pick my mother up from her teaching position, since her car had broken down. Wasn't overly happy at having to pick my mother up, until I met you, and then I considered it fortuitous.
His smile was a little self-effacing, he thought, and Bonnie seemed to respond to it with a small smile of her own. She still wasn't eating, though. And you two fought over me? He nodded. It wasn't his proudest moment.
I saw you first.
He lifted a shoulder.
But you weren't interested in me. As soon as you saw Joel, you didn't have eyes for anybody else, which, of course, only made me love you more, because I admired that loyalty and wanted it directed at me. Even back then, it was hard to find a woman who wanted to stay.
Maybe she was remembering what had happened with his wife, how she'd left. It was exactly what he didn't want to have happen. She hadn't been loyal. At the time, it seemed like they were going through hard times, but life got a lot harder after that. It hadn't taken much to make her go. Beauty drew his eye, probably like any man, sure. But Bonnie's laughing eyes and her steadfast loyalty to her husband had made him want her for himself. So, I guess I'm missing a lot of the story, she said thoughtfully, because I have a lot of questions. Where did you go? What happened with you and your wife? How did we come to be emailing each other? Did you know who I was then? Her head tilted again. The waitress came back. Can I get you anything else? She asked, setting a full glass of water down in front of him. He hadn't even realized he had drained the last glass. She picked up several dirty dishes. I'm fine, thank you, Bonnie said.
I don't want anything else either, thanks,
he said. All right, then. I'll bring you the check, and you can pay at the register. The waitress hurried off with their dirty dishes.
I guess the story was a little bit more involved than what I thought it was.
So much for romancing her today. She hadn't even eaten her lunch.
I guess you can take a girl to lunch, but you can't make her eat?
She laughed a little at his attempt at humor, and he appreciated it. Much of the story that they were talking about didn't make him look very good. A man, separated from his wife, who'd fought with his best friend over a girl who was obviously in love with that best friend. Yeah, he definitely didn't look good. But he'd started it, and she deserved the rest of the story. The waitress came back with their check and laid it on the table. The little restaurant wasn't very crowded, and he didn't feel rushed to get up. Nobody was waiting on their table.
I told you we fought, but I knew it was a hopeless cause for me. At that same time, I had a business opportunity in New York City, and I thought it was a good idea to get away. So I did. I met Donna there, my wife. Probably married her too soon, too young, too rash. Maybe I was trying to compensate for what I'd lost in North Dakota. I don't know.
He didn't want to say too much. He'd been head over heels in love with Bonnie when he left. Even though they'd been corresponding by email for a long time, decades, it felt too exposing to say that out loud right now anyway. Maybe someday he could tell her exactly how he felt. That it definitely had something to do with how soon he got married and what a mistake that was. He couldn't blame everything on Donna. Your businesses in New York City must have done very well. Her voice was polite and a little more formal. He hated that, but it probably served him right. He tried not to let it bother him.
They did. I was there a lot. I spent a lot of time building and investing and making smart decisions. I got lucky, too. I can't deny that.
He slid the check to his side of the table, but didn't pick it up.
I heard Joel was sick, and I came back out here. You didn't know. I was still married. Donna and I had lived apart for 15 years, but neither one of us had filed for divorce, and I supported her.
Donna had lived with a man for a while. She didn't know he knew. He hadn't been jealous, because he didn't love her. He was tempted to end his support, but he didn't want to rock the boat. He'd been making a lot of money, and she'd been allowing him to keep most of it. He'd been able to reinvest it. She could have demanded half. She probably would have gotten it, but they'd have been in court for a while. With lawyers' fees and the eventual court judgment, he could never have done what he was able to do. The very least he could do was continue to support her. You visited him in the hospital? She asked softly.
No.
He looked down at the table.
I met him in town. You weren't with him. I don't know where you were. Probably home with the kids. He and I sat in the church for a while and chatted. He didn't have a problem seeing that I still carried a torch for you. Even though I told him I was married, I think he knew that I was 100% sure that I would go after you once he was no longer in the picture.
But you didn't.
Didn't I?
She sat with her brows narrowed. It didn't take long before her mouth opened in an O. Understanding crept across her features. Somehow you figured out that I needed my computer fixed. Is that right? He nodded slowly and debated about telling her this next part. He knew she had no idea, and he didn't want to brag. But it was also a confession.
After your husband died, I started sending you $1,000 a week.
He waited. Shock opened her eyes wide. She straightened as though backing away from him. He'd sent the money every week for the last 20 years, and she hadn't known it came from him. She swallowed, hard. He spoke again.
And yes, I happened to hear from a mutual friend, whom I'd asked to keep in touch with you and inform me about you, and money talks, so he kept it quiet, that you needed help with your computer.
Yeah, he'd been a stalker, and now she knew it. He blew out a breath.
But I didn't come see you. Not only was I still married, even if Donna was living with someone else, but Joel had asked me, the day we sat in the church and talked, to stay away from you as long as my wife was still alive, at least until all of his children had graduated from high school. He told me you were pregnant.
He raised a brow at her.
Charlie just graduated?
Her head nodded slowly. Last week.
I kept my word to Joel.
Her look turned contemplative. Your wife left. You've been alone all this time? Her question hung in the air, and he knew exactly what she was asking. Not really if he'd ever lived with anyone. She wanted to know if he'd been with anyone. He couldn't lie. He tried not to lie anyway, but he definitely could not lie to Bonnie. Not about this. Not about anything.
I haven't been alone. Most of the time, yes, but not every night.
Her lips pursed, and she nodded, accepting his answer as the truth. Of course, it was the truth. He would have liked to have been able to give her a different answer. He was sure she knew it too. She had wanted a different answer. He could ask her the same thing, but he was almost certain what her answer would be. She'd been raising 8 kids, and she'd been emailing him every week. He knew she didn't have time for romance, and she hadn't thought anyone would be interested in a woman with 8 kids anyway. She was probably right. Except, Bonnie was a pretty amazing woman, and the kids hadn't scared him. Actually, having the children had probably shaped her into an even better woman. Kids had a tendency to do that to people. I appreciate your honesty, she said finally.
It's better to be honest to begin with than caught in a lie.
He shrugged a shoulder.
I can't say I've never lied, but I try as hard as I can to tell the truth. I've found it's the best way to do business. It's the best way to live my life.
She hadn't relaxed, still sitting ramrod straight in her seat. But the expression on her face was somehow softer, and he thought she might be understanding a little bit. If not understanding, at least accepting. But then her hand slapped down on the table, the sound echoing in the small restaurant. Several patrons looked over at them, but she ignored them. Her brows were furrowed, and for the first time, he thought he saw anger in her eyes. You're supposed to be dead. Everyone said you had died. There was a memorial and everything for you. Actually, I've been hearing about people inheriting money from you. And your niece, Roxy, inherited the Sweetwater Ranch. She crossed her arms over her chest. Yeah, definitely anger. You faked your death. Chapter 5. Bonnie couldn't believe she hadn't remembered right away as soon as she found out who he was that he was supposed to be dead. She'd gone to the memorial. Everyone in Sweetwater had, even if they hadn't known him. Sweetwater Ranch was a part of Sweetwater, and when the man who owned it died, it was a pretty big deal around town. She thought they even had a parade. Disbelief echoed in her head and chest. Why would someone fake their own death? Obviously, he was fine, healthy as a horse and sitting right in front of her. Forget that. He'd been emailing her the whole time. She probably told him about the memorial and the parade and the big deal the townspeople made about his death. And he'd been laughing through it all. Her jaw clenched, and she pushed out of her seat. She didn't need to sit here with him any longer. Someone who would deceive her like that. She wasn't interested. He grabbed the check, but she didn't look back.
Bonnie, please let me explain.
She heard him shifting behind her, probably getting out of his seat.
I think there's a good explanation. Please listen. Then you can judge, and if you want to go, of course I'll let you.
She stopped in the middle of the restaurant. She supposed she was making a scene, and she never made scenes. She'd spent the last 20 years keeping her kids from making scenes. But she spun on her foot and crossed her arms over her chest. It felt like self-defense. That's why you didn't want to meet in Sweetwater. Everyone in Sweetwater thinks you're dead. Conscious that more than a few patrons were gaping at her, she spun back around and walked out of the restaurant, knowing he wouldn't follow her. He had a bill to pay. She was halfway home to Sweetwater before she calmed down enough to feel bad. She should have let him explain. It had been a long time since she'd gone off half-cocked like that. She hadn't had the luxury. Too busy trying to be a good example for her children. Losing her temper and having a hissy fit in a restaurant wasn't exactly something she wanted her children to emulate. Yeah, by the time she pulled into the ranch, she was definitely dealing with a pile of regret and not a little embarrassment. But she wasn't going to have time to think about it. Not only was it time to feed, but two of her boys were there. Boone and Clay. She recognized their cars in the driveway. As she pulled to a stop, Clay, along with his wife Raina, and their two children came out the door. Bonnie stopped in the act of opening her door and said a small prayer, thanking the Lord for her family. Clay was her oldest son, and he'd been a blessing to her over the years, trying as hard as he could to step in the shoes his father had left when he died. She wished he'd had more of a childhood, but he'd grown into a fine young man. His friends called him the preacher, and his life had been arrow straight. She couldn't be prouder of him, and she loved Raina like her own daughter. And of course, her grandchildren were the light of her life. Not just Clay's children, but all of them. It hadn't been that long since she'd seen them, but when she got out of her car, she walked up to them and put her arms around Raina. Raina's life hadn't been easy, and she'd often said how Mrs. Stryker was like a mother to her. That comment warmed her heart every time. And of course, Gina, their oldest daughter, and the story of how Clay raised her by himself for 10 years, was nothing short of a miracle from the Lord. "Hey, Mom," Raina said. "I didn't realize you were going to be gone. I wish we could stay and chat, but Clay has a meeting set up on the farm with some seed guys." "You didn't know. It's okay." Bonnie gave one last squeeze and stepped back, keeping her arm around Raina's shoulders. "How are you feeling?" "The sickness is pretty much gone. Now I have the easy 3 months. Easy being relative." They laughed together. Pregnancy was never easy. "Maybe you and Clay and the girls can come over for supper sometime this week." As she was speaking, the thought ran through her mind of what Howard would think of her loud and boisterous family. It sounded like his life had been spent mostly alone, except for the women he'd been with. She wasn't sure she wanted to know anything more about them. She could understand it, the reasoning behind it and everything. Not just because of loneliness, although she'd been tempted over the years to try a little harder to find someone, a companion, someone to talk to, another adult. And yes, there were lonely nights and the desire to be held. No, she couldn't blame him at all, even if she didn't agree with it. Still, another mature adult wasn't the same as a whole house full of loud, boisterous kids, teenagers, young adults. It got crazy at her place. Howard would definitely not be used to the noise and activity.
You know, Mom, sometimes I think you like Raina more than you like me,
Clay said as he put his arms around her and gave her a big hug. Every time she saw him, he reminded her so much of Joel. He was practically the spitting image of his father, right down to the serious, studious, straight-laced personality. Of course, he joked and laughed. Joel had too. But Joel had that quiet, introspective personality and a real walk with the Lord. But underneath, there had been a deep and surprising passion. She supposed the quote about still waters running deep had been applicable in his case. She shut those thoughts off. She couldn't even go there, or tonight would be one of those nights where she was wishing for strong arms and a man's tender touch. "But of course I like Raina better. She's prettier." She smiled at her son, and he laughed. Clay held her granddaughter Ruth. Bonnie leaned over and kissed her cheek. She looked like she was about to fall asleep. "Hey, Gina." Bonnie reached out, and Gina came into her arms easily. This was what the scriptures meant when they said that children's children were a reward. She closed her eyes and savored the joy and peace she felt cover her soul. The only thing that would make this moment better would be for Joel to be here to share with her. But he'd been gone so long, and she really hadn't had those thoughts in a long time. He'd never be there again. There was no point thinking about it. They chatted for a bit more before Clay and Raina and their children got into their car. Clay had said that Boone was on his way out as well. She met him at the door. Boone greeted and hugged her, and she chatted a bit with his son Spencer, while his wife, Roxy, waited, holding their toddler in her arms. Roxy would be Howard's niece. Roxy thought Howard was dead. The thought stirred up all the roiling emotions in her chest. She wanted to ask Roxy about her family and about her uncle specifically. She also wanted to ask about the will and the stipulations in it. There had been an auction for Roxy's hand in marriage. Odd, obviously. Not something that would typically happen in the modern day. Boone had not actually won her in the auction, and that was another miracle from the Lord. She chatted with them a bit, biting her tongue about the questions that she wanted to ask, and smiling when Boone said he and Clay had fed, and that Charlie had called and said she was staying overnight at a friend's house. That wasn't a surprise, because Charlie had texted her on the way home. But since she was driving, she hadn't had a chance to respond. Boone and his family left, and Bonnie walked into the house. After so many years of the home being filled with kids' laughter and craziness, it was odd to walk into a quiet house. This was where she and Joel should be enjoying their empty nesting years together. Maybe making travel plans. Maybe sitting on the porch swing and enjoying a rest from their labor. Again, she shoved those thoughts aside. Normally, she didn't have trouble living in the past. She'd gotten over it years ago. Maybe meeting Howard today, and all the things that they had talked about, had stirred things up in her heart and soul and made her long for a companion. Someone to talk to. Someone to ease the loneliness. Someone to hold on to in the dark. And then she remembered that spark in her stomach, the one that had surprised her and made her wonder if maybe she wasn't too old, as she had assumed. She wasn't sure she wanted to find out. It had been a long time since she contemplated doing the things that married couples did after the lights went out. Or, God forbid at her age, with them on. The thought scared her. She didn't have a young woman's body anymore, and she wasn't sure she wanted to be removing her clothes in front of anyone. She walked into the kitchen and put her purse on the counter, turning the spigot on and washing her hands. She had been talking to the guy today. Talking. and she'd left angry. He'd probably never speak to her again, and yet here she was, thinking about getting married and taking her clothes off. She was such a girl. Good grief, he'd be wise to run away. Grabbing her phone, she went into the living room and sat down in the recliner, turning on the table light and petting her cat, Pebbles, when she jumped up into her lap, sniffed her, and lay down. She had messages from family and friends to read and respond to. She hardly thought that Howard would have emailed her, although she had to admit there was a small part of her that was eager to see if he had. She replied to the text messages first. There were 6 of them, with Charlie's being the most important. They texted back and forth a bit, Charlie telling her what she would be doing and where she would be going and who she would be with and what time she'd be home. Maybe she was a little overprotective, but a parent couldn't be too careful. And she was doing this on her own. She couldn't let her guard down and allow anything to happen to Joel's children. How could she face him in eternity? Finally, she checked out her 10 email notifications. Her eyes caught on the one she really wanted to see. He had emailed her. She tried to push the ballooning in her chest down. Maybe he'd only emailed her to tell her that he wasn't going to email her anymore. But that wasn't really the kind of man Howard was. It hadn't been hard to start calling him Howard. What was really hard was reconciling that Howard and Oil Man were the same person. She opened his email. He didn't usually include a salutation, but he had tonight, and she didn't consider it a good sign. Her heart trembled.
Dear Bonnie, thank you so much for meeting with me today. Things didn't go the way I had hoped and planned, but they seldom do they? We lay down all our nice, neat plans, and then life happens, and nothing turns out the way we think it will. I wanted to romance you a little today, take you out to eat, talk a little, about banal things, the weather, maybe your hopes and plans for the future, maybe a little about who I was, but I hadn't meant to spend the entire time telling you every bad thing I've ever done. I'd wanted to hold your hand, maybe sit on the park bench with my arm around you. Still want those things. After seeing you today, I know that you've grown into a better woman than I even thought that you might have. I still see the beautiful girl you used to be, and laid over that is the wise woman you've become. Through our emails, I know your compassion, your heart for your children, and your service to others. I've admired it all. And after meeting you today, I could see your resilience, that you laugh easily, and that you have not forsaken your moral compass. I know you don't understand why I had to fake my death. I'd like the chance to explain it to you. And yes, I've been living under a different name. That's why I've been a silent partner. I know I've taken a risk, coming clean, telling you my real name, even meeting you. But for me, the risk is worth it, for the opportunity to be with you. I understand you might not feel the same anymore. Maybe you never did. Maybe I read more into our emails than I should have. I understand if you never want to talk to me again, and I understand if you never want to see me again either. But I want you more now than I did yesterday. This wasn't an easy email to write. I feel vulnerable and exposed in ways that I never have before. But I lost you once. No, I never had you to begin with. But I've been given a second chance to try to win your heart,
and I bared my heart hoping you'll take pity on me and give me the chance I covet. Yours truly, Howard. Chapter 6. Howard paced the floor. It had been 2 hours since he'd sent his email. Surely she'd seen it by now. Of course, they'd never sent piles of emails to each other in one day. 2 per week. That's pretty much what they did. Once in a while, she'd send him an email asking about something specific that he might have mentioned that he was doing, and he might do the same, asking about a program that her kids were in or how a ball game went. He hoped she didn't make him wait. He'd gotten home and poured his heart out in that email. He wanted to know what she thought of it so bad he could almost taste it. Her rejection was going to hurt like nothing else ever had, but he'd rather face it, find out now. He had some work he needed to do for his business, but he didn't know if he could get his mind to calm down enough to focus. His housekeeper had left supper in the oven, but he wasn't hungry. Grabbing his phone, he decided he'd go to his basement gym and work out some of his excess nervous energy. He wanted the chance to explain himself. No, that was ridiculous. He wanted far, far more than that. He wanted everything. He hoped he hadn't blown his chance today. Of course, no one could say he was smooth or a ladies' man. He'd certainly not acted like either one of those today. He had a foot on the top stair when his phone buzzed. He looked at it immediately. Then his chest swiveled and shook. It was from Stryker Mom. He didn't bother to go find a place to read it, but sat down on the top step. His legs were shaking so badly he was afraid he'd fall down the stairs if he tried to read it standing up. His fingers shook as he swiped and clicked, trying to open the email. It took several tries. He wasn't sure if he'd ever been this nervous in his life before. Everything he'd hoped for the last 3.5 decades, could be completely lost in the next 5 minutes. At least her salutation was encouraging. Normally, she called him Mr. Oilman, if she used a salutation at all. Dear Howard, I'm sorry I left in a huff. Please forgive me. It was rude of me and inconsiderate to not give you the chance to explain. I know we've only emailed, but I feel like I've known you personally for these 2 decades. I've admired you and respected you for that long as well. The very least I could have done was to have given you the benefit of the doubt. I can't even tell you the last time I got angry and stormed out like that. I guess that shows you how much you mean to me. Up until today, I would have said that we were friends, maybe even good friends. But I felt today, while I was talking to you, and while I was driving home, that my feelings were stronger than the word friend implies. I want to be more with you, but even though my children are older and grown, I still have to be cautious. I know you understand that. I don't believe that you are a liar nor a deceiver, but I do need to hear your explanation. I hope you haven't changed your mind about giving it to me. I know you want to avoid Sweetwater, but I wanted to invite you to my ranch. My youngest daughter, Charlie, as you know, is taking a trip to Missouri, where we believe her older brother Wilder is now living. She's leaving in 2 weeks. She and Wilder were close growing up, and she's been in touch with him lately. I know I told you everything when Wilder left and how it broke my heart. I'm hoping, with everything in me, that Charlie is able to visit with him and eventually maybe those fences will be mended. Regardless, I will have the house to myself for the last 2 weeks of May at least. If it's acceptable for you to come to Sweetwater and meet me at my house, I would love to have you. I understand if that might make you uncomfortable, And if it does, I'd be happy to meet you somewhere else. With fondness, Bonnie. With fondness. Oh yeah, that was quite different than how she usually signed it. With that and the salutation, he was encouraged. Of course, the letter itself was encouraging. His heart skipped and tumbled in his chest. He couldn't get it to calm down. This was definitely not a given, although it was a step in the right direction. The direction he wanted to take, anyway. Meeting with Bonnie had only solidified what he'd known for years. She was an easy woman to love, and the only one he wanted. He had just decided that he probably should try to get some work done that day when his phone rang. He pulled it out of his pocket and saw it was the lawyer, Peregrine Seitzler, who was in charge of the billion-dollar inheritances that he had set up, and swiped to answer. "Hello?" Maybe his voice was a little more cheerful than it usually was. Definitely. He was definitely more cheerful than usual. "Mr. Edwards, Peregrine here. I have your monthly email report typed up, and I was calling to go over it as we usually do before I send it." Peregrine was one of those people that didn't seem surprised over anything. Ever. He'd been the perfect choice to oversee the allocation of the will that he had executed, even though he hadn't died. That was something he was going to have to explain to Bonnie. He shoved the thought aside and focused on the conversation. "Okay, I'm ready." He really did enjoy hearing Peregrine's report every month. So far, they'd been pretty much all good news. Everyone who had been offered the $1 billion inheritance had accepted it and complied with the rather unreasonable stipulations. "Well," Peregrine said. Howard could almost see him pushing his spectacles up and running a hand over his thinning hair. "All couples are still in compliance. A total of 7 couples have made it past the 1-year mark and are still living in North Dakota. I have one person who has yet to respond about the letter, and from what I can tell, he has not made any moves to get married. I have 6 more letters written and ready to date and send out as soon as you give the okay. Everything is progressing smoothly, and the money in the account is exactly where we thought it would be." Howard had walked to his office, placing his phone on speaker and setting it on the desk, while he crossed his arms over his chest and paced the floor. He had been more successful than he ever thought he would be with the letters and money. But of course, he'd chosen carefully too. He hadn't been giving them out to just anyone. The 6 new letters that were ready to go were slightly different. Up until that point, he'd sent 12 letters out, and 11 of them went to men. The next 6 were all addressed to women. In Howard's experience, women were more emotional about these things. It was much easier for a man to receive the letter, see the stipulations, and make a logical plan to implement those stipulations and inherit the money. Women, on the other hand, tended to complicate things. He'd thought long and hard before he'd given the okay to Peregrine to address these last 6 letters. So far, the fund to enforce the stipulations had not been touched. He had a feeling with this next batch of letters, that might change. Regardless, there was still one loose end from the last batch of letters to tie up.
"How much longer until the date on that last letter runs out?"
Paper shuffled on the other end of the line before Mr. Peregrine's voice came back on. 2 weeks.
"Okay. Normally we do a monthly check-in, but I want you to contact me in 2 weeks. Let me know the status and any other details you're able to procure."
He stopped pacing, planting his feet in the middle of the floor and looking out the window. He really wanted to be in North Dakota himself, looking out at the flat, endless landscape. If things worked out with Bonnie, maybe he would be. Otherwise, he had an opportunity in South America, and he was going to take it. He might never return. He'd spent enough of his life mooning over a woman he couldn't have and who didn't want him.
Any other updates?
He asked. Mr. Peregrine cleared his throat.
Well, Palmer and Ames, the first two recipients of the $1 billion, now have 2 children and are happily settled on Palmer's family farm.
Here, Mr. Peregrine paused.
I really didn't know how this whole plan of yours was going to work out. When they showed up here at the petting zoo, I wasn't entirely sure that staying home in North Dakota was in their future. Rather uncanny the way their story worked out.
Mr. Peregrine couldn't see him, but Howard nodded in complete agreement. He hadn't had any idea how things would work out either. And he certainly hadn't pictured Palmer and Ames figuring out things the way they had. Everyone in Sweetwater had known that they were best friends, but they were such opposites. Palmer was so easygoing and relaxed, and Ames was such a tumbleweed but so driven to be successful in everything that she did. Still, they'd come up with a solution that had kept either one of them from giving up everything. Love seemed to have conquered all, at least in that situation.
Maybe money doesn't ruin everything,
he said, thinking back on his own life, because really, it felt kind of like it had. Mr. Peregrine harumphed an agreement, and they talked for another 15 or 20 minutes before hanging up. Howard woke up his laptop and began to rearrange his schedule. Bonnie had invited him to her home, and he was going to be there. Chapter 7. Bonnie threw a small square hay bale off the mow. Her kids were gone. She had the house to herself, and she wanted to get the feeding done before Howard arrived this evening. That, and she was nervous and needed something to do. Pulling her gloves up, she bent and grabbed the twine on the second bale. They didn't make too many of these small bales because they were so labor-intensive, but they were nice for her to handle when she was by herself. She could run the skid loader, she could put the forks on, and she could put hay in the feeder, but she didn't really like to do it. It used to be the boys who did it. Then Lark and Charlie had taken over. All of her children could drive the skid loader better than she could. Bonnie supposed, with Charlie graduating and planning on spending the summer in Missouri, she would need to brush up on her skills. But for now, she used the small bales. Shifting her weight, she used her hip and knee to push as she swung the bale out and tossed it over the edge of the mow. Whoever had stacked the bales hadn't gotten the end one in solidly, because as her weight shifted before she let go of the twine, the hay bale underneath her tilted forward, throwing her off balance. Her arms flailed as she lost her balance completely and started to fall. Her fingers caught on the binder twine of one of the bales beside her, but all she succeeded in doing was pulling that bale off with her, creating an avalanche of bales. Which was probably a good thing because instead of falling the 20 feet directly onto the barn floor, she kind of tumbled out with the bales. They were scratchy and hard, and one must have hit her face because her cheek burned, but she didn't land with a hard thump. Rather, she kind of dropped onto the floor, bales flopping down around her. Thankfully, none landed on top of her. It had been a long time since she'd taken a tumble like that, and she lay there for a minute, getting her bearings. Pretty sure she wasn't hurt, she tested both legs, then her arms and fingers, and then pushed herself to a sitting position. She pulled her gloves off and touched her face. It burned, but her fingers came away clean. No blood. Which was a relief. All of it was a relief, actually. She wasn't hurt, but she did have a mess of bales on the floor. The shaft of light that cut through the darkness where the barn door was cracked widened. She twisted and looked around, wondering who would be opening the barn door, since all of her children were gone, and no one was supposed to be back. Some of her boys might come and help with feeding on different days, but no one had been planning on coming today. Not that she knew of, anyway. With the sun behind him, she couldn't really tell who it was, but it looked like a man. Tall and broad, with long legs that were thicker than any of the girls who might be here. "Clay?" she called. She could imagine that he'd show up without texting her first, just to help, but it could have been any of her boys.
"No, it's Howard."
He didn't say anything more, and he didn't move to come in farther. Of course, he was early, a lot earlier than she had been expecting. He said he'd be in tonight, maybe in time for supper. To her, that was 6 or 7 o'clock, not 3. If she were younger, she might have scrambled to her feet. As it was, she rose slowly. Her back twinged a little in protest, probably not from the fall. Her back usually twinged in protest. It was a complainer. She really wasn't paying attention to her back anyway. It was her stomach which was doing flips and loops and all kind of crazy acrobatics that made the little fall that she'd had look like a stroll down the street with a baby carriage. Why was she so nervous? Maybe because of the way she'd stormed out the last time. They had both emailed since then, though. She had apologized, and he had forgiven her. He was here, wasn't he? Maybe he just wanted to make sure that she understood everything he had wanted to say. She didn't know. And she didn't really want to care. But she knew she did. For some reason, it really mattered to her what he thought. Of course, she wasn't exactly presenting herself in the best light now, rising from the floor with hay bales scattered all around her. Well, there was nothing for it but to face it head on. She learned that from having kids anyway. "Why, Howard!" She almost snorted at how stupid she sounded. Not like she had just gotten up from a big pile of hay bales. No, she sounded like she was welcoming him into her parlor. "How good to see you. I wasn't expecting you quite this early." He shifted.
"Yeah, I know. I had the chance to come sooner, and I took it."
He almost looked embarrassed, like he had been the one caught wrestling with hay bales. Maybe he was concerned about what she might think of him coming sooner than he had planned. It implied eagerness on his part. She liked that. It didn't exactly erase all of her embarrassment from her predicament, but it assuaged it some. "Well, I was in the middle of feeding." Her voice trailed off. She might as well be honest. "Actually, I had fallen out of the hayloft, although until that happened, I was in the middle of feeding." There, she felt like she had been as honest as she could be. He took a step closer. His tone held concern.
"I missed it. I did wonder why you were lying on the floor among all those bales. So that wasn't intentional."
He seemed to realize, since she was standing there conversing with him, that she was okay, and his tone shifted, holding a little bit of humor in that last question.
"Because I kind of thought you were taking a nap."
She laughed. "No, I'm old enough that napping in the hayloft does not interest me at all. I want my own soft, comfortable bed. My back already hurts. Hay bales would just make it worse."
"Okay, I'll keep that in mind. Scratch the romantic picnic in the hayloft."
That changed things. Maybe she wasn't as immune to the charms of the hayloft as she thought she had been. Not if Howard were with her. He looked back and forth before coming closer.
"Are you alone?"
He huffed out a breath.
"I don't mean that the way it sounded. I'm not trying to see if I could take advantage of you. I'm just checking to make sure nobody's going to see me. I haven't decided how I'm going to deal with that yet."
"Yes, I'm looking forward to talking about that today. Tonight." She drew in a breath and put her hands on her hips, surveying the bales that were lying around her, wondering how she was going to clean them up. She didn't need to put them back in the hayloft, but she would need to stack them somewhere. She couldn't just let them lie on the barn floor like this.
"Maybe you'll let me help you?"
he asked. "Oh, I wouldn't want you to get dirty." He walked out of the shadows and into the beam of light where she could see him better. He was wearing a plaid shirt and jeans, work boots. Whatever his plans had been, he was dressed for work, even if his clothes did look new. He could probably see the realization on her face about his intentions to be a help, because he ignored her comment.
Do you want these stacked on the floor here? Or are you trying to put them back in the mow?
We can stack them on the floor. I'll need to throw 2 down to the cows. He didn't say anything more, but picked up a bale and pressed it against the side of the mow, like he'd done it before. Which he probably had, since he'd owned the Sweetwater Ranch before he'd gone to New York City.
You don't see too many small bales like this anymore. I spent many summers in my youth packing our barn full of them.
She pressed her bale in tight against his and walked back for another one. The kids humor me some, and we usually make a couple hundred of these every year. They know I don't like to use a skid loader, although I can. And I'd rather move these around. But yeah, it's too much work. He put another bale down against the mow, and she stacked hers long ways on top of the first 2. Normally, she didn't have a problem working in silence, and she never felt the need to chatter. But she did feel like she needed to explain. I was planning on being done with this, having supper ready and having a shower before you got here. I'm a little disoriented since you came early, and I'm definitely not ready for you. He paused in front of their growing stack of bales.
I wasn't expecting you to be. I can help you feed. That's not a problem. In fact, I was hoping I could.
He set the bale down.
You're on your own for the shower, but I can follow directions in the kitchen. I can chop vegetables and I can use the stove with supervision.
She set the hay bale she was carrying down where it belonged with a grunt and a chuckle. That's good to know. I'll keep that in mind. He smiled at her laughter, and something in her heart shifted. Their eyes caught, and suddenly she was out of breath, and it wasn't because of the hay bales. His chest seemed to be going in and out more quickly than usual as well. His jaw tightened as his eyes searched her face. The dust sparkling through the sunbeams, the cattle bawling in the field for their feed, the sweet smells of animals, everything that was familiar faded away. She was caught by his eyes. The space between them shortened and disappeared, and she wasn't sure if it was because she moved or he did. Suddenly, they were standing in front of each other, and his fingers were on her cheek, and she had a palm on his chest. Was she pushing him back, or were her fingers fisting and trying to pull him closer? It had been more than 20 years since she felt anything like this. These sensations that swirled and moved in her chest, the cramping of her stomach, the desire to move closer and lean up. New scents teased her nostrils, something clean and masculine, and it called to her, with that something else just elusive enough for her to want to stretch even closer, searching for the scent so she could take a big lungful of it. She had forgotten where they were, what they were doing, and she was seconds away from closing the last step between them and putting her arms around him. But he blinked, like coming out of a daze, and he shook his head a little. Then he stepped back. Her hand fell from his chest, and his slipped off her cheek. Neither of them was young. It wasn't like this was exactly new to them. But it kind of was. And she tore her gaze away, trying to understand what was going on in her heart and soul. She didn't even know this guy. But she did. Surely she got to know someone a little bit after writing to them for 20 years. But he had secrets, billion-dollar secrets, and that scared her. And sure, over her life, she'd learned that she couldn't live by her fear. But she'd also learned that sometimes fear was there for a reason. He spoke first.
I'm sorry,
She put a hand up, the same hand that had just been on his chest, the one that still tingled from touching him. Don't apologize. You didn't do anything wrong. She didn't meet his eyes, looking around. There were still hay bales that needed to be stacked.
We need to talk,
he said. I know. Let's finish this first, though, please. She wasn't ready for a big, heavy conversation. She was still shaking and needed to get her emotions under control first. Her feelings, or whatever it was that made her heart sigh and her eyes want to linger on his. She hadn't really thought of him as a romantic interest. Much. This was probably attraction. It had simply been so long since she'd felt it, she wasn't recognizing it. Or she was recognizing it, but maybe she was fighting it, because he was so complicated. Did she really want to get involved in this? The whole town thought he was dead. Who faked their own death? That would be a question for later. One of many. They finished stacking the bales in silence, although Howard hummed a little while he worked. She liked that. She particularly liked it when she recognized the hymn melody. Before she knew it, she was humming along. Taking one of the 2 bales she needed to throw out to the cattle, she walked across the barn floor and stopped at the open hay hole. She couldn't remember if she told him she needed 2 bales or not. She'd been a little disconcerted when he showed up. But he followed her carrying one of his own. She broke her bale, and he imitated her. They threw the hay out together, scattering it so the cattle had room to feed. It wasn't ideal, but it worked for when she was feeding alone. I just want to check and make sure the water is working, she said. Then I'm done here.
I'll follow you.
His voice curled around her heart, and her eyes hooked on the stubble on his chin. She loved that rugged look. But she only stared for a second before she turned on her toes and walked off the barn floor, waiting for him to follow her out and closing the door behind them. They walked around to the fence where Bonnie could easily see the water trough was full. She hadn't really been planning on staying, but Howard put one foot on the bottom rung of the fence and leaned his arms over the top. How long had it been since she just stood and watched her cows eat? There was something very soothing about the munching of cattle, their slow movements and their total unconcern for anything but eating. There was no worry or hurry, and it was relaxing. She shoved her hands in her pockets and leaned against the fence beside him. She didn't say anything, and he didn't either. The spring breeze, warm now but with the promised touch of coldness when the sun went down, blew across the field, bringing with it the smell of new growth. Then the scent of fresh grass, and that wild North Dakota smell that felt like home. It was a clean scent, one that she could feel the whole way down into her soul, and she took a deep breath. Relaxing. Just slowing down and feeling the rhythm of nature. It went at a much slower pace than she usually did. And she hadn't thought to stand and enjoy it until the man beside her did. She didn't really notice how much time passed. All she had to do tonight was wrapped up in Howard, and if he wasn't in a hurry to get to it, neither was she. The cows cleaned up most of the hay before his foot came down off the rung and he straightened, dropping his arms.
It's been a long time since I stood and watched cattle eat. Forgotten how soothing it was. I think it's the sound of the munching on that hay that just feels elemental and real, almost musical. Thanks for letting me stand there for a bit.
She nodded, although she hadn't done anything. She hadn't let him do anything. If anyone told anyone thank you, it should be her thanking him. He'd pulled her out of her head and helped her to just be for a little bit.
My stomach's saying it's time for me to start helping you with supper.
She smiled and raised a brow. Well, your stomach's going to have a little while to wait. Around here, it takes time to cook supper. I don't have anything I can just pull out and have ready. He grunted a chuckle.
Yeah, I guess I knew that. I'll try to tell it needs to cool its heels for a bit.
They smiled together, an easy smile. But she didn't allow herself to get distracted, and they turned, starting toward the house. He walked alongside her. They hadn't taken 2 steps when their hands brushed. If she thought about it, she would have thought it was an accident. Except she'd barely formed the thought when his fingers curled around hers, and they threaded together. Through the years, she'd held little hands, then bigger hands, and every once in a while, she held her teenage kids' hands, hands that were bigger than hers, much bigger than hers. But it had been years since she felt the simple pleasure of walking beside a man and having him hold her hand. It was almost as beautiful to her soul as watching her cows eat or lifting her face to the wild wind. Maybe it was just as beautiful, but in a different way, because it made her feel warm and safe and cherished. She liked the feeling. They stopped at the porch, taking their boots off, and his hand released hers. She would have been flat out lying if she said she wasn't disappointed. Maybe, of all the things that had happened so far, having him hold her hand had been the best. She tried to get her mind off that, to think about what she was cooking for supper. She had it started some. The meat was thawed, and the vegetables were out. She hadn't started cooking it. She thought she had a lot of time. She also needed to get a shower. And she needed to brace herself, because she was going to find out things about Howard she might not want to know. Chapter 8. He'd forgotten. He'd forgotten what it was like to stand at the fence and watch cows eat. Of course, he'd never known how much better it was with a woman beside him. When he was younger on the ranch that he had sold in northwest North Dakota, he certainly had never thought that a good time with his date would include standing at the fence and watching the cows eat, although he'd done it almost every night with his own dad. He liked that Bonnie had been willing to stand there. She hadn't felt like she needed to talk or fill the air between them with words. Not that he didn't like to talk, because he did, but sometimes it was good to be quiet, too. Sometimes it was good to kick his brain into neutral and just exist. He didn't typically think that way in the city. He never thought that way in the city. He hadn't come to North Dakota to let his brain rest. Of course, it probably wasn't North Dakota so much as the woman beside him. Although he couldn't really get Joel out of his mind. Bonnie had loved him at one time, and Joel and he were as different as 2 men could be. Would she be satisfied with someone like him? Well, he'd taken a lot of risks in his time. One didn't become a billionaire, a multi-billionaire, without taking risks. Pretty much every day. Some days, he risked more money than regular people would see in a lifetime. Sometimes the risk didn't pay off. Sometimes he lost. Money, it didn't matter. He could lose it, he could make it. It didn't matter. But a person, a particular person, Bonnie, was a completely different story. He felt like right now they might still be able to go back to the relationship they'd had, emailing once or twice a week. He'd know the details of her life, some of the things she thought, even her opinion and her feelings. And he'd send the same, or similar, back to her. He'd been satisfied with that. But now he wanted more. In order to get more, though, he could lose what he already had. And that was the risk. He held the door open for her, and she walked in, graceful and smiling. He swallowed against the tightness in his throat, suddenly nervous. What he said before he walked out this door the next time could determine the course for the rest of his life. He wanted it to be a course that included her. Not just her words on a computer screen, but her presence beside him. The rest of his life, years that stretched out seemingly endlessly when he was a youth, had become a finite number. It seemed too short of a time, but for whatever he had left, short or long, he wanted with all his heart to have Bonnie beside him. Would he be able to convince her? No, he didn't want to have to convince her of anything. He wanted her to want to. And what were the chances of that happening? In his experience, they weren't very good. She'd already chosen another over him once. But he was going to take the risk, and he was going to do his best. She went to the sink to wash her hands, and he followed her, breathing in her cinnamon scent and the more mature smell of woman.
You know, I've never seen this kitchen full of teenagers, but as I'm standing in here now, I'm remembering the emails that we sent when your kids were younger, with homework scattered across the kitchen table and someone doing the dishes and you supervising everything. Those days don't seem like that long ago.
He spoke while he washed his hands, and she nodded, smiling softly beside him. I never knew whether you were actually reading what I wrote or not. I tried not to go on and on about my family, but that was my life. She shook her hands and turned the spigot off.
I loved reading about your family. Maybe because I didn't have one of my own.
Your wife never came back? She looked up at him, her brows raised, and she dried her hands on the towel. He noticed a little tension around her shoulders, like she'd forgotten about his wife. And he remembered he'd never actually told her the rest of the story. That was something he could do right away.
It's the reason I suggested we meet. She passed away 2 months ago.
There was no doubt that the expression that passed over her face was relief. He should have made sure to tell her that the last time they were together. Bonnie wasn't the kind of woman to be out with a man who had a wife somewhere, although she knew they had been separated for decades.
About 10 years ago, she was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. That was when she decided she wanted to move back in with me.
Bonnie stopped with her hand on the refrigerator door. You mean she married you, left you, lived with another man, allowing you to support them, and was away for years, and then just decided to come back? He nodded.
It's partly me. I never filed for divorce. Of course, she didn't either. But when she reached out and started talking to me again, I didn't shut her down. Maybe because she was my wife.
Or maybe because he'd been lonely. It wasn't hard to get a date. Money talked. Often, the date would be happy to come home with him, spend the night. Some of them even stayed for a while. But none of them were what he wanted. Those weren't the kind of relationships he wanted. They weren't the kind that were right, and they always left him feeling empty and nagged with guilt. But he wasn't free to pursue anything long-term, unless he'd taken the trouble to divorce his wife. Bonnie seemed to see, maybe more than he wanted her to. So you didn't love her, but it was easier to have her come back than it was to find someone else? She set the meat on the counter and got a skillet out. You can brown this if you want to. He hadn't browned his own hamburger for a long time, but he had cooked some growing up, and he wasn't afraid. Cooking wasn't rocket science, or relationship science. She'd made it seem like he'd only wanted his wife for one thing. He didn't love her, but he'd never used her. He chose his words carefully.
Maybe it was easier, But I'd also made vows. They did mean something. To me, anyway, even if she'd left.
He supposed she left could be considered the worst part of for better or worse. But she'd also broken those vows when she'd taken up with another man. God hadn't expected him to keep broken vows. Once they were broken, he was free to leave. He just never had. He couldn't say he wasn't the kind of guy who left, because he had left plenty of times in his life. He'd sold his ranch in northwest North Dakota. He'd left Sweetwater. And he'd left Bonnie. Although, if Bonnie hadn't been in love with Joel, he never would have left her. But he wasn't the same man now as he was then. Maybe he needed to leave, and the rest of his life needed to happen in order for him to become a man that she could love. He hoped that were true. The thought encouraged him.
Those aren't mushrooms, are they?
He asked with a lighter tone in his voice. They didn't need to talk about serious stuff all the time, did they?
They sure are. Don't tell me you don't like mushrooms,
she asked, holding the package in her hand.
You know what they grow them in, right?
He asked, ignoring her question. Her lips twitched as she kept the package in her hand and walked to the sink, opening it and turning the water on.
Dirt. They grow them in dirt.
She rinsed the fungi off in the water.
Manure. They grow them in manure.
He emphasized the word both times. But he should have known that wouldn't bother the farm girl. Shoulder lifted, she didn't quit rinsing the mushrooms off.
That's what dirt is. All of your plants are grown in dirt. Potatoes are completely covered in dirt. And we eat them. Mushrooms are no different. They're good for you.
He had to tease her.
Manure is different than dirt. It has a completely different smell, for one. The texture is also different. Manure is dirty. Dirt is...
Well, he might have talked himself into a corner on that one. He tried for a quick save.
Cleaner.
Bonnie shut the water off, shaking the water out of the colander where the mushrooms sat. She tilted her head.
Did you just say that dirt was cleaner than manure?
Yep, that's exactly what he just said. Not exactly the kind of brilliant logic one might expect from a billionaire businessman. Well, there was still probably a way to win this argument, and he wasn't prepared to quit.
That's what I said. It's true. There are millions, no, billions more bacteria in 1 square millimeter of manure than there is in the same amount of dirt.
He figured manure was probably measured by volume, but since he was just kind of making his argument up as he went along, he didn't bother to correct himself.
Square millimeter, she asked. Square.
She put the colander on the counter and stood beside him at the cutting board.
I think we need to talk about cubic millimeters, which, for some reason, makes me feel like you might have made your statistics up.
Right. Busted. But he was sure he was correct. Manure did have more bacteria than dirt. At this point, though, it might be better to ignore her very accurate point. He cleared his throat.
Also, the bacteria in manure is more dangerous to humans than the bacteria in dirt. Basically, manure contains bad bacteria, and dirt contains good bacteria.
Technically, I believe bad bacteria can be found anywhere.
Her knife clicked down on the cutting board, and the mushrooms fell off in slices.
But since you've been dead for the last 20 years, I suppose you might not be caught up on the latest on microorganisms.
He coughed over a laugh.
I guess you got me there.
She laughed a little, but it didn't have a whole lot of humor in it.
I really wasn't trying to get you, but along with wondering about your wife, I probably spent the most amount of time since I saw you last wondering what in the world would make a man feel like he needed to fake his own death.
She threw the mushrooms into a bowl and grabbed a bag of spinach. He stirred the meat, which was almost cooked, unsure if he wanted to get into a big discussion before supper. He supposed he should probably just say it and get it over with. Unlike last time, he figured he wasn't exactly coming here to romance her and try to get her to fall in love with him. He figured he was going to pull the curtain back on his ghosts.
I actually didn't fake my death.
She tilted her head and looked over at him, the water running over the spinach leaves unnoticed.
Why does everyone think you're dead?
He quit stirring and fingered the handle of the spatula, studying it while he answered her.
Probably because my lawyer told them I was.
She didn't move. It was only a few seconds while she processed what he said and the implications, but it felt like a really long time as the seconds ticked off slowly in his head, millisecond by millisecond by millisecond. Like time had slowed down. But he would wait, because he wanted her to understand he had never lied. However, she swept right past that.
So you got your lawyer to lie for you and tell everyone you were dead?
Her voice held censure, and her hand stuck on her hip, her eyes narrowed. His lips curved up, but he kept his eyes on the spatula, running his finger down over the edge of it.
No, I don't believe he ever lied, and I certainly never told him to. He just contacted Mr. Brussel, who owned the funeral home in Sweetwater at the time, and told him he wanted to have a memorial service for me. He didn't need to say I was dead. People just made assumptions.
People just made assumptions?
She asked incredulously, although there was a hint of humor in her voice as well.
That seems like a logical assumption when one is having a memorial service for someone.
Logic is kind of old-fashioned.
He was being facetious, and he thought she probably knew it, although there were certain subsets of people who elevated feelings over logic. He typically didn't belong to them.
If something is reasonable and right, you don't throw it away because it's old-fashioned too.
Bonnie shook the spinach off and put it in the colander. Her face was relaxed. She wasn't upset. She seemed to realize he wasn't being entirely serious, and she didn't seem to mind. Maybe she knew he needed a little humor to get through the subject they were talking about.
Regardless, my lawyer said there would be a memorial for me, and there was. People came to the maybe logical conclusion that I was dead, and so when a will was produced, it wasn't surprising.
That's all well and good. But why? Why did you do it? That's what I don't understand.
She held a package of cherry tomatoes under the spigot, rinsing them as she spoke. Her brows had drawn down, and he figured this was probably a question she pondered a good bit since they last spoke.
This might be kind of hard to understand,
he began. She snorted, and he got the impression that it was a sarcastic snort. One side of his lip curved up even more, but he continued with his explanation.
Giving away $1 billion. $1 billion is a lot of money, and giving it away is going to draw a lot of attention to yourself. Maybe that's good attention, or whatever. I don't know. But it was attention I didn't really want. But
this was the part that was near and dear to his heart, and the part he couldn't joke about.
But I saw our young people leaving. North Dakota's a hard state. It's cold in the winter, freezing cold, deadly cold, and hot in the summer, with flies and bugs and humidity that's almost unbearable. It's hard to make a living here. There aren't a whole lot of industries, not much in the way of business, and it can be a hard, lonely life. Farming is up and down, and prices are always up. It's hard to make a living from the land.
He thought he smelled the meat burning, and he realized he hadn't stirred for a while. He got the spatula in one hand and turned the burner down some.
But there's a sense of community here. Maybe sometimes it feels like the rest of the world is completely crazy. I was only partly kidding about the logic comment. Logic doesn't seem to matter anymore. It's what you feel. We don't have that here in North Dakota, at least not too much. We just have the values that our parents had, and our grandparents. The character their ancestors have passed down through generations that they brought with them across the ocean. Hard work and diligence. There's so much good here in North Dakota, and I hated watching our young people have to leave.
The meat had been stirred. There were a few pieces that were a little browner than necessary, but he hadn't burned anything. He lifted his eyes, hoping she'd understand.
I knew I could do something to help them stay. And sure, I could build community centers and even a business park, or put roads or whatever modern conveniences many people think you need in order to have a good life. But the thing that made me the most sad were people leaving the farms, especially when they didn't want to. But they just couldn't make a living there. I knew I could help that, and maybe encourage a little character along the way. If I said they had to stay married, they had to stay here, they had to do hard things.
He put his hand up.
I wasn't just giving them something.
He waved the spatula, careful not to let grease drip on the stove.
I mean, they could have fought the stipulations. I could never have won in court to enforce them. But it would have been expensive, and every one of them decided to follow them. Sometimes,
he said slowly,
sometimes money ruins everything. And if you're just handed something without having to do anything for it, you maybe have a tendency to waste it or not appreciate it. But if you have to work for it, it means something to you. If you've had to live without it, particularly money, maybe you're less likely to squander it when you do have it.
He put the spatula back down in the meat, which was done. He turned the burner off.
I tried to be careful about which people I chose to get money, and honestly, I hoped I wasn't ruining their lives.
Bonnie had finished with the tomatoes and stood beside the salad she'd put together, her hands on the counter, just staring at him.
And this meant enough to you that you were willing to be dead to the community and the state that you claimed to love?
He knew she had a good point, but he felt like he had a reasonable explanation for that, too. He couldn't really tell whether she understood the logic behind what he had done. So he had no idea if she'd understand this either.
It's just like I was saying. Sometimes we have to do things we don't want to do. I wanted to be here. I loved it here. But it made more sense for me to leave so that I could do something that would hopefully be best for more people.
You made a sacrifice, so other people didn't have to.
If I hadn't done it the way I did, it would have become about me. Because it's not a little thing to give away $1 billion. It's not a little thing to will $1 billion either. But if I'm dead, then there's no media circus. I did it as quietly as possible. And, interestingly, most of the people who've gotten the money haven't made a big deal about it. I haven't been in Sweetwater, but I've had people who have been, and they said you can't tell the billionaires from the non-billionaires. I like that.
Bonnie's gaze slipped from his face and traveled briefly down his clothes. He wasn't dressed like a billionaire. He hadn't been dressed like a billionaire when they met before in the restaurant in Rockerton. Maybe it was his working-class roots, but he felt if he had to flaunt his money with his clothes and other bling, it was probably more about him. But he wasn't judging. People could do with their money whatever they wanted. He was just happy that the grassroots guys who'd inherited the money from him had handled it in their low-key way. "Well," Bonnie said, drawing the word out, "how about we take a break from this conversation while I think about what you said, and we eat?" Howard knew he could disagree. He could insist that they needed to finish this conversation now, so that it was over. But Bonnie had a lot to think about. It was only right to allow her the time to do so. Chapter 9. "So you're playing God?" Bonnie asked, her feet tucked up underneath her and a glass of tea in her hand, as they sat on the back porch swing and watched the sun go down. It was probably too cold to be sitting outside, and she was wrapped in a blanket, but it was so beautiful out. She'd suggested it, and Howard had agreed immediately. He hadn't sat down on the porch swing with her. Instead, he'd leaned one shoulder against a porch pillar. His glass of tea sat on the banister, and he faced the setting sun. She had to admit he looked good. His confident bearing was not arrogant, just self-assured enough to be attractive. His salt and pepper hair might not be attractive to a 20-year-old, but she was far from a 20-year-old. The gray in his hair, even the hairline that was slightly receding, spoke of wisdom and a life lived well. Both of those things intrigued and appealed to her. Interesting, as she aged, how her interests changed. She wasn't interested in the wet-behind-the-ears little boys who were only slightly older than her children and who didn't know anything. She'd much rather take the wisdom, the battle scars, and the older and wiser body. Unconventional thinking, maybe. Still, he filled out a shirt pretty well, and she admired the width of his shoulders, and the slight stubble that gave him a rakish, almost bad boy look. Yeah, she definitely liked that. He was shaking his head.
"No, I'm not under any illusion that I'm God or anything close."
"But you're using your money to try to influence the way people live." Using one's money for good, she could admire that. But trying to influence them? That smacked of arrogance. They hadn't talked about any of this while they ate. The conversation had been light and jovial, similar to their emails. It wouldn't be hard for her to fall for this guy. Maybe she already had. She'd probably been slowly falling for years as they wrote to each other back and forth.
"They don't have to take the money."
His eyes roamed the sky, which was brilliant orange and pink with light blue fading into the dark.
"There's nothing wrong with me putting stipulations on giving someone money. That would be like saying someone is playing God if they offered to pay somebody for doing something. That was basically it."
He shrugged a shoulder. She sat her tea down on the banister and pulled the blanket closer around her. The orange glow bathed the porch. She wasn't sure how to answer him. She didn't really think he gave the money out of arrogance, but there was no doubt he was trying to influence people. He hadn't told her who, exactly, he'd given money to, and she wondered if some of the people that had received an inheritance had been her children. Before she could ask about it, he started talking again.
"I gave you that $1,000 a week, every week since Joel died. I suppose you wonder why it wasn't more."
He shoved a hand in his pocket but kept his eyes on the sky. "The thought hadn't even crossed my mind. I was surprised that it was you, that I was actually emailing you, and you were giving me money without my knowledge. I'm not sure how I feel about that, but no, I've never even thought about why there wasn't more. I honestly was just grateful to have it."
"It was dangerous enough that I was giving you that much. At that time, I wasn't dead yet.
he said, his cheeks bunching up in what she assumed was a smile, even though she couldn't see his face, just his profile.
I wanted to give you more.
This time he did look over at her.
You have no idea how badly I wanted to give you more.
It wasn't hard for her to answer that. I'm glad you didn't. I'm really glad you didn't. Don't get me wrong. We used that $1,000 a week and needed it. Honestly, I know I would have lost the farm without it. But I'm glad you didn't give us more than what would alleviate the desperation. She tried to choose her words carefully, wanting to say something that maybe wasn't socially acceptable. I think it was good for my kids to suffer. It wasn't easy to watch, wasn't easy to live through. But I can't imagine what kind of people they would be today if all they had to do when they were growing up was sit around and entertain themselves. I know that's kind of crazy. People don't think like that. But looking back, it's easy to see they wouldn't be what they are today if they had everything handed to them.
I agree with you completely.
Just one sentence, but she knew he understood what she was saying. He stood quietly for a little bit, and then he started softly.
You have some fine boys. They turned out well. Joel would be very proud of them. Your daughters are a little younger. I don't mean to leave them out, and I think they're going to be just as fine as your young men.
His tone had made her eyes travel to his face, trying to figure out whether it was sadness or possibly regret that shaded his voice and touched her heart.
Sometimes, when you send an email about your kids, I'd wish they were mine, or at least that I was there, helping you. I know that's not right, because I was married, and it wasn't a thought I allowed to stay in my head, but it was there at times.
She swallowed. As often happened at dusk and dawn, the wind died down, and a hush had fallen over the North Dakota prairie. Too early for the summer night sounds, and they didn't live near any bodies of water where they might hear peepers this time of year. Just the hush of night and the occasional creak of the springs on the swing. But the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was more like the silence between two old friends. She didn't feel any great need to fill it. What could she say to that anyway? Something occurred to her, and she opened her mouth. There were a lot of times I wish I had somebody beside me. But I never went looking, because I figured God would bring them around in His time. I can't say that I wasn't tempted to go looking, though, because I spent a lot of lonely nights, alone. She wasn't sure what reaction she expected from him, if any, but it sure wasn't the spinning on his foot and the striding over, a fierce look on his face. He bent down beside her on one knee and put his hands on her leg.
That's why I'm here. That's why I came. That's why I needed to see you. We could talk about all of these other things, but all I really wanted to do was share some tender moments with you and hope that you might be able to, if not fall in love with me, start to think that maybe being with me would be better than being alone. Darkness was falling, but she could still see his eyes, and she searched them with her own. I can see that. I can see that easily. Especially when I remember that the person in front of me right now is the person who was with me through it all. Even if it was just emails. You have no idea how much I depended on them and looked forward to them, and how much strength and comfort they gave me. I'm sure I would have made it through without them, but they were a huge blessing and help to me. She reached a hand out from the blanket, feeling bold, knowing there was no one else in the world that she would touch like this. But her fingers drifted across his cheek,
and her hand scraped across his stubble as it prickled her palm.
If my children have turned out well, if they are, as you say, fine young men and women, it's all God. But if there was any human who could take credit, it would be you. Your emails kept me sane.
Maybe she shouldn't have admitted all of that. She shouldn't have told him how much she came to look forward to and depend on those emails. How she wondered, at times, if he were ever to stop writing to her, what would she do? Howard straightened from his position. As good as her hand felt, they hadn't settled everything yet. He squinted off into the darkening night. He wanted to hear more of what Bonnie was saying. They'd shared a lot of information over the years, but not a whole lot of thoughts and feelings, maybe. Thoughts and feelings normally weren't things that interested him. But with Bonnie, he wanted to know everything. Everything. Something moved in the dark, and he strained to see. The swing creaked as Bonnie leaned forward, realizing he had tensed.
"Are those your cows?"
he asked. The swing creaked again. Then Bonnie gasped.
They have to be, but they definitely don't belong there. We just planted corn.
She stood, standing by his side.
I only see two. They're pretty close to the corral gate. Maybe I left it open, and they're the only two that have gotten out.
He had spent enough time on farms and ranches to know it wasn't probable, but he smiled at her statement.
"Positive thinking at work."
She laughed.
It's a habit I could never break.
"It's a good habit to have."
Yeah, sometimes it led to pie-in-the-sky thinking, but pie-in-the-sky thinking was a lot healthier than doom and gloom thinking all the time.
"I have a flashlight in my car. I'll go get it."
He looked at her scent drifting up to his nose, and he wanted to reach out and touch her, put his hand on her arm and touch the soft skin there.
These aren't your cattle, and you don't have to help. But I'll run into the house, grab a flashlight, and throw my boots on.
She half-turned but stopped with her face lifting up to his as she spoke.
"Do you really think I would stand here and watch you put your cows back in and not help you?"
He was pretty sure she didn't think he was that kind of guy. Then again, maybe she did. After all they talked about was him and his money.
No, of course I don't. But you can't think I'm the kind of woman who would expect you to help me put my cows in. Not a guest here for the evening.
"I'm pretty sure where I grew up, if something needed to be done and we had people there, they pitched in and helped, and no one thought anything else about it."
Her lips tilted in a guilty smile. Yeah, that's what he thought people around here expected. She was definitely treating him differently. Whether that was good or bad, he wasn't sure.
"I'm going to get that flashlight."
She nodded and turned. His hand reached up and touched her arm. She stopped, and her eyes flew to his. But he didn't have anything to say, and he didn't have any reason to stop her. He hadn't meant for his hand to do that. It was so hard to stand beside her and not touch her. Maybe she could tell by the look on his face that he hadn't meant to, because her eyes registered confusion. Her eyebrows raised as though questioning why. And of course, he didn't have any answers, other than he'd waited for years to know the feel of her skin. Chapter 10. He wanted to put his arms around her and pull her to him. He wanted to talk about things other than money and what he'd done with it, about things that might really matter for them, like what she wanted for the future, her hopes and dreams, and if he was really blessed, she'd want to know his. He wanted to tell her, that was for sure. Of course, that wasn't why he couldn't keep from touching her. He'd waited a long time to kiss her, too. But the cows were out, and the longer it took them to get them back in, the further they went from where they belonged, and the harder they would be to contain.
I'm sorry, I wasn't planning on touching you.
Maybe her breath came a little faster, a little harder. Maybe her eyes were a little wider. It's okay. I don't mind. With those words, she finished spinning and hurried into the house. Probably she had moved so quickly that she didn't see the smile on his face. She didn't mind. That boded well for him. He didn't have any promises from her, but he was pretty sure that if she didn't mind, that meant she'd let him do it again. Only next time, maybe the cows wouldn't be out. He couldn't get the big, happy smile off his face, but he did turn on his flashlight. Hopefully, they would be too focused on the cows for her to see him grinning for no reason. No reason for her. He knew exactly why he was grinning. It had been a long time since he'd chased cattle, though, so he probably ought to focus on what they were going to be doing. He didn't exactly know what the lay of the land was, so when she came back out with her flashlight, he was waiting for her.
I've chased cattle, so I have an idea, but you have to tell me what to do.
He shoved his hand in his pocket, the one that wasn't holding the flashlight, so that he wouldn't be tempted to touch her again. I figured you were up for it. Let's go see if the corral gate was left open. And if there are any cows left in. We'll take care of them first, and make sure we have a place to bring these two. Her voice was brisk, and it didn't surprise him. She was a woman who raised 8 children without a husband. He didn't expect her to be a shrinking violet. But there was a sweetness, and a bit of humor in it as well, like she was able to roll with whatever life threw at her. They walked together through the dark evening sky until they reached the corral, where the gate was open. Drat, she said. I can't believe I didn't latch this. She chuckled a little. This is something that the kids would have definitely gotten in trouble for when they were younger. But I guess mistakes happen.
That's true, they do. The key is fixing your mistakes. That's what kids need to learn.
He knew that's what she believed. They'd talked about it before. And he couldn't agree more. It was less about being punished and more about cleaning up the mess. You know, though, she said, wiggling the gate. This feels loose to me. I think it'll still latch, but we should tighten it tomorrow. She walked across the corral, opening up the far gate. He pushed the cattle that were left through the gate, and they secured it behind them. With that done, they could leave the corral gate open and not have any more escapees. Let's see if we can do this on foot. She looked at him in question, like she would do it a different way if that wouldn't suit him. He nodded and put his hand out.
Whatever suits you. I'm just here to do whatever you say.
She harumphed. Come on, let's go get on the other side of them. They walked around, making a wide berth so they didn't push the cattle further out into the cornfield. Her cattle weren't wild, and they were able to move them slowly and carefully back to the corral, all 4 of them. One rather stubborn cow almost missed the corral opening, but they herded her back, and soon all of them were contained once again. I think for tonight we'll just leave them all in here. There's water and hay, and we'll work on separating them tomorrow.
Sounds good,
he said, walking over with her to open the gate between the 2 fenced areas. That wasn't as hard as I was afraid it was going to be, she said after they'd left the corral and were walking back toward the house.
Me either. Back in the day, I might have spent hours chasing cattle that had gotten out just like that.
Me too. We got to them in time. Her face smiled up at him in the moonlight, and he thought about taking a chance. He hadn't exactly gotten to talk to her about how they felt about each other, but she couldn't be confused about how he felt. He held his flashlight in one hand as he walked beside her. Her hand swung on one side, and she stuck her flashlight in her back pocket. He moved closer, and the backs of their knuckles touched, brushing against each other. Her breath caught, hitching a little, and he thought that was a good sign. On the next swing, he turned his hand and caught her hand in his, holding it. Her hand twisted just a little, and his stomach tightened, afraid she was pulling away. But she was settling it more firmly in his. At least, that's what he thought. Stretching his fingers out, he held his breath. She did the same. Sweetly, almost inevitably, their fingers laced together. The night was quiet, but his heart thundered. She'd given in so sweetly he almost felt foolish for worrying. But having Bonnie had never been a given. Finally, their clasped hands swung between them. She wasn't the kind of woman who was going to allow him to hold her hand if there weren't feelings for him behind it. His heart sang. A soaring melody. It was joyful and excited at the same time. One his whole body wanted to share in. Sure, if Joel were here, he'd still be married to her. But it didn't make Howard feel like second place, because Joel wasn't there and hadn't been for a very long time.
"This feels better than I thought it would,"
he said, holding their hands up just a little, so she would have no question about what he meant. "So you thought about it, huh?" she asked, and her voice sounded a little sassy. It made him grin.
"If you must know, this isn't all I thought about."
They had reached the bottom of the stairs and he stopped, turning and facing her, keeping their hands clasped. "It's not." She didn't back away but allowed him to get as close as he wanted, which was very close. She put a hand on his shoulder, and his stomach twisted into a tight knot. He could hardly believe that what he'd been hoping for was happening. "And what else were you thinking about?" Her voice was soft, with maybe a little bit of flirtatiousness in it. He might have smiled, but now that the moment was actually upon him, he was afraid he wouldn't do anything right. He'd done a good bit of kissing in his time, but this was Bonnie, the woman he'd wanted forever. Still, he hadn't become a billionaire by being afraid, so when her hand slipped from his shoulder to his neck, and the distance between them shrank as she moved closer, he didn't pay attention to what his stomach was doing. He just breathed in her scent and relaxed into the feel of her hand on him before sliding his own arms around her and running his hands up her back. She shivered in his arms, which made him smile, because he didn't want this to be only him wanting her, and that shiver told him maybe it wasn't. "If you're going to kiss me, you're taking your good old time." Her whisper came out of the darkness, her lips moving close to his. So close he could feel the soft puffs of her breath on his face.
"Do you know how long I've waited for this? You can't think for 1 second that I want to rush it."
His fingers touched the soft skin of her neck, stroking down. She shivered again, and then her fingers touched the sensitive skin just above the back of his collar with the lightest of touches. Soft, feather-like hints of contact, and it was his turn to shiver. Her husky laugh floated in the darkness.
"You're doing that on purpose, aren't you?"
he asked, laughter in his own voice, mixed with tones of passion and desire. "I'm doing whatever I can think of to get you to lower your head and kiss me the way I want you to."
Am I not allowed to enjoy this moment and want to prolong it?
She sighed in his arms and settled more fully against his chest. I love that you're taking your time, truly, and I appreciate it too. There are some things that are better when they're not rushed. Her finger ran along his cheek and touched the corner of his lips. But I think you've maybe waited long enough. His throat was suddenly dry, and his focus was completely on her finger. The touch and the feel and the anticipation. His heart trembled with it, and his knees were weak. He lowered his head, breathing her air. And finally, after what felt like an eternity, their lips met. Hers were soft and warm, and better than any dream. All the years of waiting melted into that moment, and the world shifted and shook under him. But he couldn't lift his head and didn't want to. Not really thinking, but never wanting it to end. Her soft sigh and the pressing of her body to his were things he vaguely noticed, and they sent his already thumping heart racing faster and harder. He'd suspected for a long time that kissing her would be this good, but he hadn't really known. The heady whirlwind of feelings, the weakness in his legs, the straining of his heart, and the need of his body to get closer completely took him off guard. Her hands raked through his hair and down his back, and she seemed to have the same urgent need to be closer to him. He heard a moan, and he wasn't sure whether it was hers or his, but he knew then that he needed to pull back. Just an inch, barely separating their lips. His eyelids felt heavy, like they had weights on them. Her eyes were barely open too, and a sweet little smile lifted her lips. It was a smile he couldn't resist, that made everything in his chest balloon into something bigger and greater. Maybe pride, he wasn't sure, but that smile told him that she liked it, that he made her happy, that kissing him was something she enjoyed, and that, to be honest, was even better than the way her kiss had affected him. He certainly hadn't imagined the way it would make him feel. Happy and proud and powerful, and at the same time made him long to do it again, to put that smile on her face, because of his kiss. So he dipped his head again and gently touched her lips with his. A slightly different kind of kiss, a gentle one that allowed the softer feelings in his soul to be exposed. One that said, I love you, without words. He wasn't sure whether she got the message or not. He didn't really mean to give it anyway. He didn't want to be exposed. He didn't want her to know how he felt, necessarily. He wasn't sure how she felt, and it was too soon, anyway. Plus, he didn't know if there was any future for them or not. What was the point in telling her how he felt, only to end up leaving? If she did decide there was a future for them, and she wanted to be with him, then they needed to figure out where they were going to go and what they were going to do. Because if they stayed here, he had to figure out how to undie. Chapter 11. Bonnie couldn't keep the dreamy smile off her face, even as Howard's lips touched hers again, softly and gently, seeming to say how much he cared about her. Actually, they seemed to say, I love you. She didn't know what her response was saying. She certainly wasn't dictating it. Maybe nothing. It had been such a long time since she'd been kissed, but she didn't think that was it. She wouldn't feel like this kissing just anyone. With Howard, she never wanted it to end. He pulled away from the second kiss, and she had to bite back a groan of frustration. She didn't want him to go. She forced her hands to keep from holding on to his neck, but continued to play with the short hairs back there in a dreamy sort of way. And she didn't pull her body back, because she wasn't sure she could stand on her own. He didn't say anything as they stood breathing quietly together in the dark, and she was content with the silence for a while. But there was a part of her brain that wanted to know what was going to happen. What did this mean? Where did they go from here? For her, life was pretty simple. She was free, had been free for a while, to pursue a relationship if she chose to. Maybe she had been ready before. Maybe she just hadn't found anyone that she liked as much as she liked Howard, whom she'd only known as Oil Man. Whatever it was, right now the issue wasn't her. She couldn't keep her thoughts in any longer. What are we doing? That really wasn't the question she wanted to lead with. She knew exactly what they were doing, and she wanted to keep doing it. But that was in the moment. She wouldn't be happy with in the moment forever. Even now, her brain was prompting her to push to know what this meant, where it was heading. She just needed to find the words to ask the question. He shifted slightly after her question, like thinking about it made him uncomfortable. She could understand that, and she hated to press. I don't want you to think that you've kissed me and now I expect a ring. It's nothing like that. But I would like to know. He touched the tip of his finger to her lips, and she stopped immediately.
I know. You deserve to know what I'm thinking and where this could possibly lead. I know you're not the kind of girl that kisses a guy in the dark and walks away from that without a thought.
His finger traveled across her bottom lip, then his palm cupped her cheek.
And you're right. A future with me is kind of complicated. How would that look? Where would we go? What would happen if the people of Sweetwater knew they'd been lied to? Or at least they thought they'd been lied to, because no one ever really lied.
Some people might never forgive him. Folks didn't take kindly to being deceived. Whatever stigma he had, she would have too. No, I agree. There were a lot of assumptions made. But it was staged to look like your death is what happened. Technically, it's not lying, but it was purposely deceitful. There was no censure in her voice, but she couldn't absolve him from all guilt. The people of Sweetwater believed what he wanted them to.
I can't argue. You're right.
It hadn't really been an argument, and she had won, but it didn't feel good.
I will lay it all out on the table for you. It feels like a dangerous thing for me to do. And I'm not used to feeling vulnerable like this.
His hand traveled down, and he clasped both of her hands with his, stepping back.
Can I come tomorrow? Can I lay everything out for you then? Can we maybe talk about it and decide what we want to do? We're not teenagers. We can be adults about this, right?
She felt like a teenager with the raging hormones she didn't even know she still possessed. She certainly hadn't felt like this since she'd been a teenager, with Joel. But being with Howard brought all those feelings back, and more, maybe, because she was old enough to know how valuable a man like Howard was. You're welcome to come tomorrow, of course. If you come by 7, I'll cook you breakfast. And if you come earlier, you can help me feed. She squeezed his hands with hers. The desire to step into his arms again was strong. But things should get settled first. She'd never been a fling kind of girl, and she wasn't going to start now. She didn't think Howard was that kind of guy either. If he were, she didn't think she'd be interested in him.
I'll be here.
His voice held firmness, and she had no doubt he meant it.
Neither of those other two kisses felt like a good night kiss.
She heard his smile.
I don't mind practicing to get that type of kiss down right, but I think I'll need your help to make sure it stays short and sweet.
She laughed. She liked he was kind of making fun of the way they'd gotten carried away. And she could definitely roll with that. Maybe with both of us working toward short and sweet, we might achieve it.
We can hope, right?
He said as his head bent toward hers. She reached up at the same time, eager for more. He was right. She knew he was. They needed to be working toward short and sweet, especially since they didn't know exactly which road they were heading down. She didn't want him hurt, of course. She was probably already past that point where, if he decided to walk away, she'd be crying. Their lips met, and while it wasn't exactly short and sweet, she was pretty sure Howard did manage to get home before midnight. In the morning, Bonnie woke with a smile, humming a song, a cheerful hymn that seemed to be stuck on replay in her brain. It wasn't a mystery as to why she was so happy. She didn't have a problem jumping out of bed or getting dressed. When she walked out the back door, heading toward the barn, Howard was sitting on the top step of the porch, bundled in a heavy winter jacket against the chill of early spring, wearing work boots and jeans, dressed to work. He stood as soon as he heard the door open and turned toward her. His silly grin probably matched hers.
Are you up for practicing some good morning kissing this morning?
He asked, the humor from last night touching his words. I think we need to do a lot of practicing. That probably wasn't the answer she was supposed to give, but she didn't really care. She decided she was already past the point where she'd be hurt if he left, so why not enjoy the kissing while it was there, right? They didn't talk any more, but she stepped directly into his arms, and they spent more time than they should have practicing their good morning kissing. Fun practicing. Hand in hand, they walked to the barn and threw some hay down for the cattle. There weren't many, and it didn't take long to make sure that everything was fed and the automatic waterers were working.
Didn't you say that gate latch was loose?
Howard asked when they were done. I'd forgotten about that. Way too much kissing. She hadn't been thinking about her cattle at all. They walked over, and Howard examined it.
This screw's almost falling out, and the one beside it already has.
I should have noticed that yesterday when I tried to latch it. I just slid the bolt and assumed it went in. I guess we're lucky the cattle didn't push against the gate and open it in the middle of the night. They walked to the shed together for the cordless drill and a few screws. Howard held her hand, and she had to say she enjoyed it. She'd always hoped that she and Joel would have been the kind of couple that were still holding hands even after 50 or more years of marriage. Something else she hadn't thought in a long time. About halfway to the shed, Howard spoke.
I promised last night that I would lay everything out for you. I did a lot of thinking about it, because I knew it wasn't going to be easy. But what I want to have with you is worth taking a risk for.
Bonnie stumbled, catching herself immediately, but not before he looked down at her with concern. She wanted to talk about this. Truly, she did. But it also scared her. Maybe she didn't want to know how things were going to have to be. She cleared her throat. I appreciate your consideration, and I'm listening.
I have a condition, too.
His expression was dead serious. And that is? Her stomach quivered. What kind of condition could he be talking about?
When I'm done, I want you to promise to tell me how you feel. Honestly. And I want to know what you want.
The timbre in his voice sent shivers down her spine. She loved her children, and they were some of the most considerate children she'd ever seen. But it wasn't too often that someone was concerned about what she wanted or wanted to know how she felt. I promise. It was an easy promise to make, but she knew the words probably wouldn't come out easily. Because he was asking for her to give voice to things she'd never uttered before. Still, if he was doing these hard things for her, she could do that for him.
Fair enough.
They reached the shed, and he opened the door. It only took her a few seconds to grab the drill, slap a battery in, and put a handful of screws in her pocket. She wasn't exactly a stranger to fixing things. He waited until she'd walked back out, his eyes tracking her. Maybe making a note of where things were kept. If the gate needed to be fixed again, he'd be able to do it himself.
I've loved you since you chose Joel over me,
he said as soon as he shut the door, not mincing words or beating around the bush. Her heart turned.
When Joel died, and my wife was separated from me, you have no idea how tempting it was for me to file for divorce and come for you. But that didn't seem right, because I had made vows, and they meant something to me.
She definitely respected that. She didn't interrupt him to say anything.
I was scared you'd find someone else, honestly. But I just prayed that God would honor me honoring my vows. Looking back, I feel it was a selfish prayer, because you spent 20 years alone raising your children by yourself.
He lifted a shoulder.
Regardless, it was a prayer God answered, because I've been released from my vows by my wife's death. And you're available.
He stopped and turned to her. She stopped along with him and turned to face him as well.
I want you. I want to be with you. I want to be married to you. However that looks, whatever I have to do to achieve that. That's what I want. If you want to stay here in Sweetwater, that's fine. I'll figure out how to make an announcement to the town and explain what happened. I didn't really want word of the money getting out, and if we can do it without that, I would prefer it. People will wonder why I'd give my ranch away, and my possessions. And I don't know how I'm going to answer them. But I'll figure something out if this is where you want to be.
He took a deep breath and looked off toward the horizon, like he was gathering his thoughts.
I have an opportunity in my business to move to South America, Argentina specifically. A dangerous country, but there are a lot of opportunities there. I'm willing to go take advantage of them, and I'd love for you to come too.
His eyebrows flickered, and his chin lifted.
Or if you want to live in New York City, or some other state. Basically, Bonnie.
His eyes went back to hers, and his look was soft.
I just want to be with you. I'll work out whatever I have to in order to make that happen.
Bonnie blinked and blew out a long breath. She had to look away. She couldn't stand the intensity in his gaze. What was she going to do? She had known the choices probably weren't going to be easy. She didn't want to leave her children. She'd already lost her husband, and her kids were all she had anchoring her. And the ranch that she'd spent decades on. She definitely didn't want to pull up and abandon it all. Her eyes tracked back to Howard. He wasn't asking her to give everything up. But in order to prove that she was sincere, or maybe for her own peace of mind, Shouldn't the man that she was with mean more to her than material things? Shouldn't she be willing to do whatever it took in order to be with him, like he was willing to do for her? Her thoughts were racing, and it felt like years had ticked by, but it had probably only been a few seconds. Finally, she opened her mouth. I didn't have to think of my response for you. It's just scary to actually say it. Her lips pulled in, and she bit down on them. Even now, she didn't want to let the words out. I didn't hear you say anything that I felt we couldn't work out. Because I want to be with you too. And it doesn't matter to me what that looks like in terms of location or what we do. And if we stay here, I will stand by you when you talk to the residents of Sweetwater, however you do that and whatever they say. They might have been hard words to say, but after she'd said them, she felt amazing. She knew her smile was as wide as her face, and she didn't know whether it was her words or whether Howard felt the same way after he said what he did, but his smile was just as big.
I feel like we need to do some more practicing.
His grin turned lopsided, and she chuckled. It's funny, because I was thinking the same thing. The drill bumped against her back as his arms came around her, and she pressed into him. She wasn't thinking anything, wasn't aware of anything other than him as his lips came down and their eyes met before they kissed. Long and sweet and tender, she was completely lost in him, until a honking horn startled them, and they jerked apart. Chapter 12. Howard could admit he had never been so completely unaware of what was happening around him. Bonnie did that to him. No, actually, kissing Bonnie did that to him. When he broke away from her and looked around, there were 6 cars either parked at the house or still pulling down the driveway. How could he have missed all of that? How could he not hear cars less than 50 yards from him? But he knew the answer. When he was with Bonnie, nothing else mattered. And when he was kissing Bonnie, that was all he knew. Her head was turned too, and a look of excitement followed by a look of dismay passed over her face.
I assume you know who these people are? Did you forget about a party that you had planned?
It would be kind of odd to be having a party at 7 o'clock in the morning, but stranger things had happened, he supposed. Definitely wouldn't have happened in New York City, but in North Dakota, anything went. I could be wrong, Bonnie said, low and quick. But my birthday was Saturday, and not all of my children could make it. We just had a simple supper with Mav and Charlie. I didn't think they were going to do anything else, because Mav was supposed to be heading south with his crew, and none of the other kids said anything. So, again, I could be wrong, but I think this might be a surprise birthday party. Howard had emailed her, wishing her a happy birthday, and she had told him what she was doing with Charlie and Mav. He had never thought of a surprise birthday party. People were just starting to get out of their cars. Not people, Bonnie's children.
Do you want me to leave? Disappear?
It was hard for him to say. He certainly didn't want to. He wanted her to be proud of him, to want to show him off to her family and friends. But he didn't want to push her for more than she was ready to give. Everything was new, and he expected that she would need time to adjust. But she answered immediately, and that made him happy. No. Except for Bonnie's feelings, he couldn't say he was unhappy with this development. In fact, after years and years of hearing about her children and feeling like he knew them personally, He was actually eager to meet them. They weren't children anymore, at least most of them. The boys were grown and had become young men. It wasn't just Bonnie telling him that. He had other ways and means of hearing what happened in Sweetwater. The town was near and dear to his heart, just like North Dakota itself was. But just because he loved the state didn't mean he had to live there. Still, he was eager to meet the children that Bonnie had raised, the ones he'd heard about for so long. "Are you okay with this?" Bonnie looked up at him, her lip pulled between her teeth. From the expression on her face, he was pretty sure that if he wanted to duck and run, she'd be okay with it. There were a lot of people there, and they might not take too kindly to him. After all, they'd just seen him kissing their mother, and they hadn't officially met until a couple weeks ago. Her children didn't even know about him. Hostility was almost a given. But he had to be honest. "I've been hearing about your children for decades. I can't wait to meet them." The worry lines in her forehead eased, and she released her lip, smiling. She took his hand. "Then let's go. I can't wait to introduce you." By the time they started across the yard, all the cars were stopped, and people had begun gathering on the barn side, watching their mother and him and chattering among themselves. He was pretty sure one of the biggest topics of conversation right now was the embrace they'd caught him in with their mother. It certainly wouldn't have been for him. Definitely, that wasn't exactly the foot he had meant to start off on, but he couldn't undo it. One of the men separated from the group and stepped forward, meeting them 3 yards away from the cars. If he had to guess, he'd say it was Clay, the oldest. The preacher, and from what his mom said, he deserved the title. A dark-haired girl, with what looked like a flower tattoo sneaking up around her neck from under her shirt, watched Clay with eyes full of love and admiration. It wasn't too hard for Howard to guess that was Raina, Clay's wife. They stopped, and Howard kept a hold of Bonnie's hand while Clay stood in front of them, his arms hanging loosely at his sides and his eyes flicking from his mother to Howard and back again. The look on his face wasn't exactly one of antagonism, but it wasn't open and friendly either. "We were planning a surprise birthday party for you, Mom." Clay's eyes again flicked to Howard. "Normally, you're in the barn at this time in the morning. We thought to surprise you in the kitchen." His lips quirked just a little, and humor lurked in his eyes. "I guess you're the one that surprised us." It wasn't a question, not by any means, but it definitely implied that there needed to be an explanation given. Howard supposed Bonnie probably felt like it was deserved as well, and he couldn't argue with that. Even though this was Bonnie's son, Howard felt protective, and he opened his mouth to explain and defend. But Bonnie beat him to it. "Clay, I'd like you to meet Howard Edwards. He's a friend that I've been corresponding with for quite some time. Actually, since about a year after your father died. In all that time, I've never met him, but he does know about you and your brothers and sisters, and he kind of watched you grow up, so to speak, by our correspondence." Clay listened intently to his mother as she spoke, and his facial expression didn't change. But he nodded and lifted his brows a little when she was done. "Kinda looks like it might be a little more than friends, Mom." Bonnie could reprimand Clay for being a little cheeky. After all, it was the son talking to the mother. But he wasn't being disrespectful. And there was humor on his face as well. Howard had always had the impression that they were a family that had fun together. And he was right. Bonnie laughed. "I just met him in the flesh a few weeks ago, so I don't know exactly what's going on." Her face lifted toward his, and Howard looked down at her. "But I think we did just decide that, yes,
we are more than friends.
I'm glad that was your take, because that's exactly what I thought we were saying to each other,
Howard said to her. He couldn't deny the relief that he felt. Bonnie was claiming him in front of her children, claiming him as more than a friend. At their age, he wasn't sure the word boyfriend applied. But what else would it be? He had spoken about marriage, but she hadn't. He could hardly use the word fiancé. Plus, when he used that word, he wanted her to have his ring on her finger. And he wanted it to be a nice ring, not something that he gave her because he couldn't plan ahead. At his age, he should be able to make those kinds of plans. Then maybe, Clay said, rocking back on his heels and putting his hands in his pockets, I should be asking you what your intentions are toward my mother, Mr. Edwards.
You're welcome to do so, and I have no problem telling you. I plan to marry her, as soon as she'll let me. Today, if possible. Tomorrow, if not.
Yeah. How about a nice ring and plans for an engagement? Not. Clay snorted, then he laughed.
Okay. Well, we've got the honorable intentions down. How about we go in the house and we can do the I'm going to grill you to see what kind of person you are and if you're worthy of my mother deal.
That did not sound fun, but Howard had to laugh anyway.
Sure. As long as you're sure that's not going to ruin the birthday party. I think Bonnie deserves a nice party, and I'm pretty sure she wants everyone to enjoy it.
We're going to enjoy this. Trust me. Another man came up beside Clay. Howard, this is Boone, my second son. Bonnie waved between the two of them. Boone, this is Howard. She looked beyond at the crowd of people that were standing and staring at them. She raised her voice. Actually, everyone, this is Howard. He's a friend that I've been writing to since shortly after your father died. We finally met recently for the first time, and he's excited to meet all of you. She turned innocent eyes toward Howard. I hope I wasn't making that up, she said in a softer voice. He shook his head.
It's as true as I stand here.
A wave of relief swept over her features. Clay snorted. He turned toward the group of people. All right, everyone, we're taking this show inside. Chapter 13. As always, with all of her children inside with their spouses and children, it was crowded and chaotic in her home. But Bonnie loved it. Somewhere along the line, as a wife and mother with small children running around everywhere, she got used to the chaos, almost enjoyed it at times. It was work. There was a lot of messes to clean up. And yeah, sometimes it was nice to be alone and quiet. But nothing compared to the joy of being with her family, feeling the love that flowed between all of them. She had 6 boys, but only 5 of them were here today. Charlie had been going to Missouri to visit Wilder, the son she needed to be here to make her family complete. She was still going, but not until after the birthday party. Eventually, breakfast was made and eaten, and the candles lit and blown out, and the children had gone outside to play. Charlie had gone out with them, and 2 of her boys had left to go to work. Clay and Boone and Lark and her 3rd son, Cord, all sat down in the living room with Howard and her. Curious, she was sure, of what was going on between them. She had laughed to herself because they would be even more curious if they realized who Howard was. That realization was coming, and soon. Lark was up from Florida, looking tanned and beautiful. Neither of her girls were married, although Bonnie knew that Lark had a crush on a certain dairy farmer for years. But the man hadn't seemed interested, so Lark moved to Florida to go to nursing school. Clay, Boone, and Cord were all married, and their wives sat with them. Bonnie had to admit God had been good, and she loved her daughters-in-law as much as she loved her own children. She couldn't ask for better. And even though she knew her children wanted answers, she didn't feel like she was in the Inquisition. They had accepted Howard as they ate and included him in their conversations. She hoped things didn't get awkward as all of the truth came out.
"I know I'm the odd man out here,"
Howard began.
"but I think maybe I need to start this conversation."
Threads of nervousness twisted and twined in Bonnie's stomach. It sounded like he was just going to start off with it. And he did. For the next 10 minutes, Howard told her children everything he told her. From his lawyer announcing his memorial service, which inspired everyone to believe that he had died, to the will and the billions of dollars that had been offered and given out. At the mention of the money, her children had not seemed surprised. Bonnie didn't want to ask outright, not in front of everyone, but she would be willing to bet that her children had been beneficiaries. Interesting how these things came to light. When he had finished, Howard tightened his grip on Bonnie's hand and put his other hand over hers. They sat on the sofa together, and the room was silent. Cord's wife, Rosie, a cute little blonde who was quiet and serious, shifted in her seat. "So, are you going to stay dead?" Rosie hadn't seemed like the one that would speak if anyone spoke, and Howard had to laugh at her question. Beside him, Bonnie chuckled as well.
"Well, I guess when you put it like that, the obvious answer is no."
He looked at Bonnie to confirm what hadn't seemed clear until Rosie asked a simple question. As he suspected, Bonnie was nodding. So, no, he wasn't going to stay dead. "Well then, Uncle Howard, not to sound childish, but how are you going to get undead?" That question came from Roxy, his niece, and she emphasized the Uncle Howard, probably to let him know she knew her uncle had deceived her. He deserved it, because it was true. However, there was no dislike or hatred in her tone. Obviously, she knew she wouldn't have inherited the Sweetwater Ranch with her husband, Boone, if he hadn't done what he did. Indeed, she only paused for a moment before she added, "And thank you. Thank you for what you did and the stipulations you gave. I didn't like them at first. In fact, I resented them. But everything worked out for the good, for me and for Ryder." She referred to her brother, Howard's nephew. He'd inherited $1 billion as well. He also would be very surprised to learn that his uncle was still alive. As though Roxy had opened the floodgates, a chorus of thank yous rang out. A good sign, but he didn't think that he was in the kind of family that would forgive an egregious transgression just because there was money floating around. Maybe they were okay with his relationship with their mother as well. If he was curious about that, he didn't have long to wait. He spent the next 15 or 20 minutes answering their questions before there was a silence, and Clay spoke into it. "I'm interested in your intentions with our mom. I know you said you'd marry her any time she wanted to, but you have a past that kind of complicates things. Are you taking her away from here? Will she be safe? Will she be able to come back to Sweetwater and visit? Were you going to come clean to the town?" Clay didn't exactly attack him with questions. They were measured and calm, but the young man's face was serious and determined. Howard could respect a son who wanted to protect and care for his mother. Those were all questions that Howard had struggled with overnight anyway, and there was only one answer that he could give. "I'm going to come clean." He shrugged a shoulder. "That's all I can do. It's the right thing to do. And then I'm going to ask your mother to marry me. He gave Bonnie a side eye, and she was grinning up at him. He was pretty sure she would say yes.
We'll live where she wants to. I suspect we'll be living right here.
Bonnie touched his arm.
If I get to choose, that's where we'll live. But I'll live wherever you want to.
He put his fingers over hers.
North Dakota has always been my home, and what I've done with the inheritances, and even the faking of my death, was to help the people of North Dakota as much as I could.
Well, Cord said, speaking up for the first time,
I have a question.
Everyone stopped talking and looked at him.
If we have things settled with Mom.
He paused, and no one spoke, so he went on.
How did you decide who to give the money to? And I guess, more specifically, since you were writing to our mother, I guess I assumed you'd play favorites with our family. But you didn't. The first person that you gave money to was Palmer and Ames. Why?
Howard nodded. That was a question that was legitimate in his eyes, because he had wanted to shower Bonnie's children with money first thing. He stroked Bonnie's hand.
First of all, some of you weren't ready for the money when I started giving it out. Some of you still aren't. In my opinion, anyway.
He didn't need to add that it was his opinion that was the important one, since he was the one giving out the money.
But more importantly, I suppose, I could see that Ames was about to leave the state for good, and that Palmer was about to lose his ranch. In other words, I thought they might never see that they were meant for each other if the money didn't play a part.
He shrugged his shoulders and couldn't resist giving a little smile.
It took something angling. As I understand it, there were some flying hay bales, cowboy yoga, and a few shooting matches involved before they finally got together. It worked out.
His explanation seemed to satisfy everyone. There were some more questions lobbed at him, and he answered them as best he could. They asked Bonnie some questions as well, and she answered in low tones too. By lunchtime, everyone had left, and he and Bonnie ate alone at the counter bar.
What did you think of the family?
She asked as they ate their sandwiches together.
They were just the way you described them. There wasn't anything that surprised me. I knew I would love them, and I do.
Those words were easy. He set his sandwich down and looked at it before he lifted his eyes to meet hers.
I was being honest with Clay when I said I'd marry you today if I could, and tomorrow if not. You didn't say anything.
He set his hand down on the counter, deliberately relaxing it.
I wondered how you felt about it.
He'd wanted to move slowly, make plans, do a lot of discussing and deciding and thinking, because that's the way he felt adults should behave. On an intellectual level, anyway. On an emotional level, right now, this afternoon wouldn't be soon enough.
I feel the same way,
Bonnie said.
We can clean the sandwiches up and head down to the courthouse if you want to.
That's how I feel. He had to say that sounded really good to him.
Maybe we could clean the sandwiches up, practice kissing a little, and then head down to the courthouse.
That works too.
This has been The Cowboy's Second Chance, a Sweetwater Ranch Western cowboy romance. Written by Jessie Gussman. Performed by Jay Dyess. Executive production and cover art by Julia Gussman. Editing by Heather Hayton. Copyright 2022 by Jessie Gussman. Production copyright by Jessie Gussman.